The northern forest had forgotten warmth. It stretched for miles in every direction, a white wilderness devouring sound and life alike. The trees stood as frozen sentinels beneath the weight of unending snow. Wind howled through their hollow ribs, and the sky, gray and pitiless, pressed down like a curse. Through that storm stumbled a man, Alpha Kael Draven, once a name that made warriors lower their eyes, now looked little more than a ghost. His cloak was torn to ribbons. Ice had stitched itself into the dark threads of his hair and beard. Blood painted one side of his face, half hidden by frost. Each step sent a tremor through his body, but he pushed forward because stopping meant death. Behind him, the faintest line of crimson tracked through the snow. He had outrun betrayal, but he could not outrun the cold. Every memory of his pack pressed against him like a blade, the sound of steel clashing in the night, the smell of smoke and fur, the roar of his own voice calling brothers to battle. Then silence, his beta's face smiling through the treachery, the sting of silver across his ribs, the flash of a sigil he once trusted turned against him. Kael clenched his jaw. Not here. Not yet. He would not die in the snow like a broken beast. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wood smoke, thin, human, alive. Hope stabbed through him sharp as ice. He followed it, stumbling down a narrow slope until the shape of a small cabin emerged, half buried beneath snowdrifts. Light flickered faintly through the shutters. Someone lived there. He dragged himself forward, his body protesting with every move. His fingers had gone numb long ago, and his breath came out in broken clouds. The snow seemed to whisper with every step. Fall, fall, fall. When he reached the door, his vision blurred. He managed a single knock before his knees gave way. Inside the cabin, Elara Venn had been feeding the fire with her last bundle of pine logs. The blaze cast golden veins across the wooden walls, making the tiny room feel less empty. She lived with silence as her companion now. No one came to visit the woman branded a witch. The knock startled her. For a moment she thought she had imagined it, but then it came again. Soft, desperate, fading. Her heart tightened. Visitors did not find her cabin. Not by accident. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and approached the door. Her instincts, sharpened by years of exile, whispered danger, yet beneath it pulsed something else. Something fragile. A scent of blood and cold fur reached her senses. A wolf, but not any ordinary wolf. She unlatched the door and a body collapsed into the threshold, heavy and frozen solid. Snow rushed in with him, swirling across the floorboards. Elara gasped. The man's weight nearly knocked her down. His cloak was shredded, his skin a deathly pale. Steam rose faintly from his mouth, the last traces of life clinging to him. "Spirits, help me," she breathed. She turned him over and saw the mark carved into the leather on his chest plate, a crescent of black iron surrounded by claw marks. Recognition hit her like lightning. The crest of the northern pack. A memory clawed its way up. Flames, screaming wolves, the Alpha's voice booming in the distance. The same pack that once hunted her kind to extinction. Every instinct told her to shut the door and let the cold finish what fate had started. But then his hand twitched. His lips moved, cracked and pale, and a whisper brushed her ear. So faint she thought it was the wind. Just the tip of warmth. His eyes fluttered open for the briefest moment. They were gray like winter skies, filled with exhaustion and something heartbreakingly human. Elara froze. Those words should have meant nothing, yet the plea threaded straight through the armor around her heart. She knelt beside him, pressing her palm to his cheek. His skin burned with cold. The pulse under it fluttered weakly. "You're a fool," she murmured. A dying Alpha begging warmth from a witch. Still, she dragged him inside. The cabin groaned under the weight of the storm as Elara worked. She stripped off his frozen cloak, cutting away the blood-soaked cloth. Wounds, deep gashes along his ribs and shoulder, told a story of battle and betrayal. Silver still glimmered in one, poisoning the edges of the flesh. She gathered herbs from a shelf, crushed them, and whispered old words her people were forbidden to speak. Her magic stirred, gentle, glowing faintly gold. The air filled with the scent of pine and smoke. As she pressed the salve into his wounds, Kael's breath hitched. "Don't move," she ordered softly. "You'll live if you stay still." He didn't answer, but a faint growl escaped him, stubborn even in delirium. It almost made her smile. Hours passed. When the worst of his shivering ceased, she sat beside the hearth and watched the flames reflect in his hair. He looked both fierce and fragile, like a storm caged in human skin. She remembered the stories told in whispers, the alpha who never bowed, the warrior who defied kings, the monster who burned villages to protect his own. Now that same creature lay dying on her floor. Why had fate brought him here? Sometime in the night, Kael stirred. The fire had dimmed to embers. His eyes opened slowly, confusion clouding them. The first thing he saw was her silhouette beside the hearth, a woman with long dark hair, face lit by soft firelight. "You're awake," she said quietly. "Where?" His voice was hoarse, rough from cold. "My cabin," she replied. "You collapsed at my door." He tried to sit, pain lancing through him. "You should have left me." "I nearly did." Her tone was even, but there was a trace of something beneath it. Curiosity, maybe pity. "But you begged for warmth. And I'm not heartless." Kael's gaze sharpened. "You're a healer." Her lips pressed together. Once, not anymore. He looked around. The shelves of herbs, the faint symbols carved into the wood. Realization dawned. Outcast magic. He muttered, "You're one of them." Elara met his eyes. "And you're alive because of it." Silence filled the room, broken only by the hiss of wind outside. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a low, ragged sound. "The gods have humor. They send me to die in the arms of a witch." "You're not in my arms," she said, standing. He studied her as she turned away to tend the fire. In the glow, her features were softened but proud, the face of someone who had learned to live with her own ghosts. For the first time in weeks, Kael felt something flicker in his chest that wasn't pain. When she returned with a blanket, he was half asleep. She covered him gently, her fingers brushing his skin just long enough to feel the warmth returning. Outside, the storm howled like the grieving of 1,000 wolves. Inside, two strangers shared a fragile peace. Elara sat beside the fire, eyes on the snow pressing against the window. She didn't know what he was running from or why fate had placed him at her doorstep. But she felt it, the quiet pull between them, like the beginning of a story neither had chosen. Behind her, Kael whispered in his sleep, voice raw and soft. "Elara." She froze. He should not have known her name. The flames crackled, and for the first time in years, warmth crept through the cabin that had known only solitude. Chapter 1. The Healer's Solitude. Part 1. The Cabin in the Whispering Woods. The storm had passed, leaving the forest wrapped in a stillness so complete it felt sacred. Every branch and stone carried the weight of snow, and when the wind dared to stir, the trees shivered softly, releasing clouds of glittering frost into the cold morning air. The sky was a pale gray dome, stretched thin and empty. In the middle of that silence stood a small cabin of rough-hewn logs and moss-darkened stone. Smoke rose weakly from the chimney, curling into the cold air before vanishing like a sigh. Inside that cabin lived Elara Venn, a woman long forgotten by the world that once praised her name. Elara had learned to live with silence. It no longer frightened her. It was company of a sort, the kind that didn't judge or demand. The walls of her cabin were lined with shelves overflowing with dried herbs, jars of tinctures, and small bundles wrapped in cloth. They gave off faint scents, lavender, pine, smoke, and earth, that softened the harshness of winter. Every morning she woke before the first light touched the horizon. She stirred the ashes in the hearth until the fire came alive again, then boiled water for tea flavored with wild mint. The same routine, the same rhythm, for years uncounted. Once she had lived in a grand hall filled with golden light. Once she had been healer of the High Council, her hands sought by kings and alphas alike. She had been honored, feared, and envied in equal measure. But that life had burned away in one terrible night, when her gift had saved the wrong life. She still saw the faces when she closed her eyes, the soldiers' torches blazing, the council's cold eyes as they accused her of witchcraft, and the wounded alpha she had tried to save gasping his last breath as the curse leapt from him into her. The mark it left was invisible, but everyone felt it. They called her tainted. They said her magic had turned black, and so they cast her out. Now years later her name was nothing more than a whisper among traders and wanderers. The outcast of the whispering woods, the witch who speaks to spirits, the woman who should not be approached after dark. Elara smiled bitterly whenever she imagined the tales. Let them speak. The forest, at least, knew the truth of her heart, and that was enough. She tied her thick dark hair into a loose braid, slipped on her wool cloak, and opened the cabin door. The cold struck her like a blade, sharp and clean. Snow covered everything in sight, yet the woods pulsed faintly beneath it, as if life refused to surrender completely. She walked carefully down the path toward the frozen creek, carrying a wooden bucket. The air was so cold it seemed to hum. Her boots sank deep into the snow, each step releasing a soft crunch that echoed faintly through the trees. Above her crows circled, their cries distant and harsh. At the edge of the creek she knelt and cracked the ice with a stone. The water beneath was dark and clear, moving sluggishly beneath its frozen skin. She filled the bucket, then sat back on her heels, letting herself breathe. She always felt the spirits more strongly here, near the water. Faint glimmers of light shifted in the air, a flicker at the edge of sight, gone when she tried to focus. They had been her only companions for years, neither friend nor foe. They didn't speak words, but she felt their presence like a pulse under the surface of the world. "You're quiet today," she murmured. Her breath rose in a pale cloud. Too quiet. The forest gave no reply, but the wind brushed her cheek, gentle as a sigh. It was almost enough to make her smile. She rose, bucket in hand, and started back toward the cabin. On the way, she paused at the row of wooden stakes marking the edge of her warding circle. Each stake bore a charm carved with protective runes, some faded, some cracked. She touched one lightly, whispering a renewal spell. The charm glowed faintly, then dimmed again. It wasn't much, but it kept the worst of the wandering beasts away. The wards had never failed her. As she neared the cabin, she glanced at the smoke rising from her chimney and felt a flicker of comfort. The cabin might be small, but it was hers. It was safe. Inside, the air was warm, thick with the scent of herbs and the steady hiss of burning logs. She hung her cloak, poured the water into the pot by the hearth, and began sorting through the day's tasks, drying frost moss, grinding roots, measuring tonic doses. The simple work kept her mind still. When the wind howled again outside, she didn't look up. She had grown used to it. The whispering woods had moods, sometimes calm, sometimes wild, like any living thing. But as the minutes passed, something felt different. The sound outside shifted, less like wind and more like movement. A faint crunch of snow, too deliberate to be nature. She froze, pestle halfway to the mortar. "Probably a deer," she whispered, though her voice was tight. Her hand moved instinctively toward the dagger on the table, an old blade she rarely used. The wards should have repelled anything dangerous. But then came another sound, a dull thud, soft but heavy, followed by silence. Elara waited. 1 heartbeat. 2. Then 3. The silence pressed harder than before. She set down the pestle, heart thudding. Every instinct told her to stay inside, to lock the door and let the forest take care of its own mysteries. Yet curiosity tugged stronger. The whispering woods had been her world for so long that even its smallest changes called to her. She stepped to the door and unlatched it. The air that met her was like a slap, cold enough to sting her eyes. She peered into the whiteness. At first, she saw nothing but snow. Then, at the edge of her vision, something dark, a shape slumped against the ground a few yards away. Her breath caught. It wasn't an animal. She hesitated, gripping the doorframe. A man? Out here? Impossible. No one came this far into the woods, not in winter. For a moment she considered shutting the door. Whoever he was, he had no reason to be here, and no business crossing her warded land. But the sight of him, half buried in snow, stirred something she couldn't ignore. She pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders and stepped out into the cold. The snow reached her knees, clinging to the hem of her dress. The closer she came, the clearer the figure became. A man, broad-shouldered, face down, his cloak torn and crusted with ice. When she knelt beside him, her fingers brushed his hair. Frozen stiff, flecked with frost, she rolled him carefully onto his back and drew a sharp breath. The face beneath the ice was striking even in ruin. Strong jaw, sharp cheekbones, skin pale as marble. Blood stained one corner of his mouth. And there, on the breastplate half hidden beneath snow, she saw it. The mark she thought she'd never see again. The sigil of the Northern Pack. For a long moment, she couldn't move. That emblem had haunted her nightmares. The black crescent surrounded by 3 claw marks. The symbol of the pack that had raised her village. The pack whose alpha had sworn that witches were a disease. Her fingers trembled. A dozen memories flooded her. Screams, smoke, the clash of steel, her own voice begging them to stop. This man? He was one of them. The cold no longer mattered. Fury flared through her, sharp and pure. It would be justice, she told herself, to let him die here. The storm had already done most of the work, and yet, as she stared at his face, she saw not a monster but a man, broken, wounded, lost. The faint rise and fall of his chest betrayed a will to live that refused to fade. Elara closed her eyes, fighting the war inside her. She had sworn never to heal another wolf, never again to touch their cursed blood. But then she remembered the way his fingers twitched in the snow, the weak sound that escaped his lips, a sound that wasn't a growl or curse but a plea. She exhaled slowly, her breath fogging in the air. Even wolves deserve warmth, she murmured. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't mercy. It was something else. A spark of compassion she had tried for years to bury, rising unbidden once more. She gripped his arm and began dragging him toward the cabin, her boots sliding on the frozen ground. He was heavy, heavier than any man she'd ever lifted, but she didn't stop. With every step, the snow fought to pull them both down, but she pressed on until they crossed the threshold of her home. The moment she shut the door behind them, the warmth of the fire hit his skin, and a faint shudder ran through his body. Elara knelt beside him, her pulse still racing, her breath quick. "Don't make me regret this," she whispered. Outside, the forest was silent once more, as if watching. Inside, the life she had locked away for years had just begun to stir again. Chapter 1. The Healer's Solitude. Part 2. The Wolf at Her Hearth. The cabin door groaned shut behind her, muffling the blizzard's howl until it became a distant sigh. For a heartbeat, only the sound of crackling logs filled the space, the fire throwing restless shadows across the wooden walls. Elara stood still, breath shallow, staring at the half-dead man she had dragged in from the snow. Steam rose faintly from his cloak as the warmth began to melt the frost. Water pooled on the floorboards around him. His chest rose. Barely. Each breath sounded like a struggle, as though even air refused to stay within him. Elara's hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of her decision. Every instinct screamed that this was folly. Wolves brought ruin, always had. They had ruined her, and now fate had placed one on her floor like some cruel jest. She swallowed hard and forced her body to move. "Don't die in my cabin," she muttered. "I've enough ghosts already." Her healer's training took over. She knelt beside him, fingers moving with practiced precision as she unclasped the heavy cloak and pushed it aside. Beneath the layers of fur and leather, his body told a brutal story. Deep gashes across his ribs, claw marks raked across his back, a puncture wound near the shoulder where the blood had frozen black. The smell of iron filled the air. She bit her lip. "What in the spirit's name happened to you?" He didn't answer, of course. His lips were blue, cracked from cold. His skin had the pallor of death itself. Elara rose and crossed the room to the cupboard. Her fingers brushed over jars and bundles until she found what she needed: dried frostbloom petals, wolf's moss, and a vial of her own secret mixture. A tonic she hadn't used in years. She poured hot water from the kettle into a clay bowl and crushed the herbs with a wooden pestle, her movement steady, but her heart restless. When she returned to him, she knelt again, the bowl steaming between her hands. "Drink, if you can." She lifted his head gently, supporting his jaw. His skin burned cold against her palms. She brought the rim of the bowl to his lips. A single drop touched his mouth. Then another. For a long moment, nothing. Then he swallowed weakly. A flicker of life. Elara exhaled, realizing she'd been holding her breath. She set the bowl aside and began cutting away the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt. His body beneath was a map of pain. Old scars layered over new wounds. Muscles tensed even in unconsciousness, as though he'd fought death every inch of the way. Her fingers hesitated when she reached the mark on his chest. The black crescent sigil inked just above his here, the same symbol she had seen blazing on the banners that night, when the northern pack had come for her village. She looked away quickly. "This doesn't make us allies," she whispered. "I'm only keeping you alive long enough to walk away." Still, her hands worked with care, as though her words were meant to convince only herself. She washed the wounds, cleaned the dried blood, and pressed a poultice of frostbloom to the worst of them. The scent filled the air, sharp, cool, faintly sweet. When she touched his shoulder to bind it, he flinched and growled low in his throat, the sound more animal than man. Elara froze. Then his eyes opened. They were silver, pale, almost luminous, like moonlight reflected on water. For a moment, confusion clouded them. Then instinct. He tried to rise, muscles coiling, but pain drove him back down. "Easy," she said sharply, pressing a hand to his chest. "You'll reopen everything." He blinked, struggling to focus on her face. His voice came out as a rasp, barely a whisper. "Where am I?" "In the woods," she replied curtly. "Alive. For now." He coughed, wincing. "You." His gaze flickered around the cabin, then back to her. "You're a witch." The word struck her like a blade. She had heard it too many times, from too many fearful mouths. "I'm a healer," she said coldly. His lips curved in something like a smirk, though it quickly twisted into pain. "Same thing. Where I come from." "Then perhaps you should have frozen where you fell," she snapped, rising to her feet. He didn't answer. His eyes closed again, exhaustion pulling him under. The smirk faded, replaced by a grimace of pain. His breathing steadied, rough but stronger. Elara stood there, arms crossed, watching him as the firelight washed over his face. For all his strength, he looked impossibly young like this. Unguarded, human. The anger in her chest faltered, replaced by something she didn't want to name. She turned away. "I'll let you rest," she said softly, though he could no longer hear her. "But come sunrise, you leave." She busied herself with chores, refilling the fire, hanging damp herbs, cleaning the blood from her floor. Yet her gaze kept drifting back to him. The cabin felt different now. Too full. Too alive. For years, she had known only silence. Now there was the sound of another's breathing, the faint weight of his presence pressing against the air. When she finally allowed herself to sit by the hearth, fatigue pulled at her bones. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stared into the flames. The storm outside had died to a whisper, snow still falling in slow, soft sheets. Her mind wandered, unbidden, to the memory of her exile, the council's cold voices echoing in the great hall, the chains around her wrists, the moment her teacher, her only friend, had looked away instead of defending her. "You've gone too far, Elara," they had said. "You meddled with power not meant for mortal hands." She had begged them to understand. She had healed a dying child. She hadn't known the magic came from the old spirits, the forbidden kind. But reason had no place in their hearts, so they had cast her into the forest, stripped of title and protection, condemned to live among the very creatures she had once sworn to heal. That was the night she stopped believing in mercy. Until now. Her eyes drifted toward the stranger sleeping by her fire. He had called her a witch. She should hate him for that, and yet when she had seen him bleeding in the snow, her heart had moved without her consent. "What are you to me, Wolf?" she whispered. The fire popped softly, sending a shower of sparks into the air. For hours she sat there, listening to the rhythm of his breathing. It grew steadier as the night deepened. His wounds no longer wept blood. The herbs had begun their work. When she finally rose to check on him, dawn's first light was creeping pale and cold across the snow outside. She knelt beside him once more and brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead. His skin was no longer ice-cold but warm, faintly flushed with returning life. He stirred at her touch, murmuring something she couldn't catch. Her gaze softened despite herself. "Rest," she said quietly. "You're safe here. For now." She didn't notice the faint shimmer of silver light that flickered briefly along his skin, a sign of something ancient awakening beneath his flesh. Outside, the forest watched. The wind carried whispers through the trees. The spirits, usually distant, stirred uneasily. The wolf had survived the storm, and fate, it seemed, had found her again. Chapter 1. The Healer's Solitude. Part 3. The Unspoken Oath. The storm had passed, leaving the world wrapped in a hush so deep it seemed even time hesitated. Pale morning light filtered through the frost-rimmed window, falling in broken gold patterns across the cabin floor. Elara moved quietly, stirring the embers to life. Each movement was automatic, yet her mind circled the same thought. The wolf still breathes. She told herself she should not care. He was a stranger, a danger. But every few heartbeats her eyes betrayed her and drifted to him. Kael lay half-turned toward the fire, his body sheened with a faint fever sweat. The wounds along his ribs had stopped bleeding, but his skin was still far too cold for comfort. His face, stripped of armor and pride, looked almost human now. The harsh lines of command softened. The stubborn mouth slackened into weariness. Elara poured water into a small basin and wrung out a cloth. As she bent to wipe his forehead, she caught the faint scent of pine and iron. It reminded her of winters long before exile, of hunts and bonfires, of a life that now belonged to someone else. She pressed the cloth to his temple. He stirred, a low sound escaping his throat. Half groan, half growl. "Peace," she murmured. "You're safe." His eyelids fluttered. Those silver eyes opened again, clouded but searching. "Where?" "You asked that already," she interrupted gently. "You're in my cabin." He frowned, disoriented. "The snow, the trees. I remember falling." "You did." She gestured toward the hearth. "The forest might have swallowed you if I hadn't found you." For a moment he seemed to study her, as though deciding whether she spoke truth. Then his gaze drifted to the bandages that crossed his chest and shoulder. "You mended me. I did what any healer would." A faint smile touched his lips. "Healer," he repeated softly, the word tasting strange. "That's not what they call you beyond these woods." Her spine stiffened. "And what do they call me?" His eyes held hers. "The Banished Witch of Venn Hollow." Elara went still. The title slid through the room like a knife drawn from its sheath. "Then you know what happens to those who cross me?" she said quietly. Something flickered behind his gaze. Pain, maybe regret. If that were true, I'd be dead already. She almost wished he was wrong. The truth was harder to face. She had chosen mercy again, against reason, and now fate had placed in her home the one kind of man who could destroy her simply by remembering her name. "Rest?" she said at last. "You're not healed." But Kael's voice carried the stubborn weight of command. "Tell me your name." "Elara," she answered before she could stop herself. "Elara," he repeated, tasting the syllables like a vow. "I won't forget it." The sound of her own name in his mouth unsettled her. It had been years since anyone had spoken it without scorn. She turned away, busying her hands with the kettle on the hearth. "You shouldn't talk. You'll reopen the wounds. I've had worse." His tone was almost teasing, but when he tried to rise, pain carved his features. He collapsed back with a hiss. "I see that," she said dryly. She crossed back to him, kneeling to adjust the bandage. Her fingers brushed his skin, warm now, alive. He inhaled sharply, not from pain this time. The air between them thickened, filled with something unspoken. She withdrew her hand as though burned. "Stay still," she ordered. He smiled faintly. "You give orders like an alpha." "I'm not," she said. "Not anymore." The admission surprised her as much as him. She hadn't meant to speak it aloud. He studied her face a moment longer, then nodded as if he understood something she hadn't said. Silence settled again, punctuated only by the crackle of fire and the whisper of wind at the shutters. Elara sat back on her heels, exhaustion finally catching up to her. She hadn't slept in almost 2 days. Yet some instinct kept her from closing her eyes. The man before her radiated danger even in weakness, an aura that tugged at the edge of her senses, ancient and wild. When she looked at the sigil burned into his armor lying by the wall, memories rose like ghosts. Flames consuming her village, wolves howling under a blood-red moon, her own hands glowing with forbidden light as she tried to save the dying. The northern pack, she thought bitterly. Of all the souls the storm could throw at my door. She reached for the basin, meaning to carry it away, but Kael's voice stopped her. "My pack," he said hoarsely. "They're gone." She froze. His gaze drifted to the fire, unfocused. "Betrayed. Slaughtered. I ran because there was nothing left to lead." Elara turned slowly. His confession hung between them, raw and unguarded. She had expected arrogance, denial, perhaps even threat, but not grief. Not the hollow sound of a man who had lost everything. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. He gave a humorless laugh. "Are you? After what my kind did to yours?" Her hands tightened around the bowl. "I didn't say I forgive you. I said I'm sorry." Their eyes met again, something fierce passing between them. Shared loss, shared exile. The air in the cabin seemed to pulse with it. Kael exhaled shakily. "Then perhaps we're both ghosts, healer." "Perhaps." She set the bowl aside. "Ghosts still need food. I'll fetch you broth." When she returned with a wooden cup, he tried to sit up. She steadied him without thinking, one arm behind his shoulders. The closeness startled them both. His heat seeped through her sleeve. Her scent, herbs and smoke, filled his lungs. For an instant, the world narrowed to the space between their faces. "Drink," she whispered. He obeyed, sipping slowly. A drop of broth slipped down his jaw. Without thinking, she caught it with her thumb. Realizing the intimacy of the gesture, she pulled back quickly, her heart thudding. "Thank you," he murmured, eyes never leaving hers. Elara turned away, setting the empty cup on the table. "You should rest. I owe you my life." "You owe me nothing," she said. "I didn't save you for gratitude." "Then why?" She hesitated. The truth felt too bare, yet lying seemed pointless. "Because I couldn't watch another living thing die." He was silent for a long while. When he spoke again, his voice was low. "That mercy may cost you, healer. The enemies who hunted me won't stop." "I've lived with danger my whole life," she said. The forest protects its own. He looked toward the window, where snow still drifted down in silent veils. Then may it protect me too. She almost smiled. Don't ask for what the forest might take in return. Night deepened once more. Kael slept, his breathing steadier now. Elara sat near the hearth, sewing a tear in her cloak, but her mind kept straying. She watched the shadows crawl across the floor, listened to the slow rhythm of his breath, for reasons she could not name. It comforted her. The spirits outside gathered again, faint lights moving between the trees. They pressed close to the glass, curious, whispering in voices too soft for mortal ears. She felt their unease and whispered back, I know. He's dangerous, but he's still mine to heal. When she looked back, Kael's eyes were open. Who were you talking to? He asked, voice rough from sleep. The wind, she said simply. He studied her, the corner of his mouth twitching. You truly are a witch. Elara rose, brushing dust from her skirt. Rest, Alpha. Tomorrow you'll be strong enough to leave. I'm not sure I want to. The words halted her steps. She turned slowly. He was watching her with a quiet intensity that made her pulse quicken. This place, he continued, it feels alive. It is, she said. The forest hears everything. Then tell it I'm grateful. She shook her head. The forest doesn't care for gratitude. It deals in debts. Then let me owe one, he said softly. For a heartbeat she didn't breathe. Something in his tone, half promise, half confession, slid beneath her skin. She opened her mouth to answer, but no words came. Instead, she turned toward the window. Outside, the first stars pierced the dusk like silver wounds. Sleep, Kael, she said at last. We'll speak in the morning. He closed his eyes, obeying, though the faintest smile lingered on his lips. Elara stood long after, listening to the wind shift, to the crackle of the fire. Somewhere deep within, she felt a thread tighten, an invisible pull that bound their fates before either of them had chosen it. She whispered to herself, barely audible, even wolves deserve warmth. And in his dreams, the Alpha heard her voice, and dreamed of fire. Chapter 2, The Alpha Awakens. Part 1, Shadows of the Past. The world returned to Kael Draven in fragments. A crackling sound, the soft hiss of burning wood, the faint scent of herbs, sharp, earthy, and threaded with something sweeter like wild mint crushed underfoot. He tried to move, but pain tore through his ribs, white-hot and merciless, dragging a ragged growl from his throat. His body felt foreign, wrapped in warmth he didn't recognize, yet heavy with exhaustion. He forced his eyes open. The ceiling above him was low, made of rough-hewn timber, darkened by years of smoke. Shadows danced across it, alive with the rhythm of firelight. He wasn't dead, not yet. The last thing he remembered was snow, relentless, endless snow, and the flash of steel against his brother's throat. Betrayal, fire, and the scent of blood. Then darkness, then her voice. He shifted, and the movement sent bottles clinking softly nearby. He turned his head, slowly, painfully, and saw her, the woman from the storm. She was standing at a wooden table near the fire, grinding herbs in a small mortar. The flicker of flame painted her in gold and shadow. Her hair, dark and loose, spilled down her back like a curtain of night. A faint scar traced her jawline, catching the light like silver thread. Kael's instincts flared. She wasn't human. Not entirely. The air around her hummed faintly, charged with an invisible force that made the wolf within him stir uneasily. When she finally turned to face him, her eyes were the color of moss after rain, deep, unreadable, and far too calm. You're awake, she said quietly. Her voice was even, but her hands tightened slightly around the pestle. Kael's gaze swept the room again. No weapons, no chains, just the scent of herbs, fire, and faint traces of wolfbane, the kind used not to kill but to restrain. Where am I? His voice came out rough, the words scraping through a throat gone dry from days of cold and silence. My cabin, she replied. Far from anyone who'd care what happens to you. There was no warmth in her tone, no fear either. Just weary indifference, like someone who'd stopped expecting kindness long ago. Kael tried to push himself up, but a sharp pain in his side sent him collapsing back onto the cot. The movement tore open a half-healed wound beneath the bandages. The healer's eyes flicked to the blood that blossomed there, but she didn't move to help. I wouldn't do that if I were you, she murmured. You'll tear the stitching. You stitched me? I did. She turned back to her table, voice quiet but steady. You were half frozen, half dead, and entirely too heavy to drag back outside. Her bluntness might have. Almost, you should have left me, he rasped. I almost did. The words hung between them like a blade. For a moment, only the fire spoke. Crackle, hiss, whisper. Kael studied her, trying to fit her into any of the stories he'd heard whispered around campfires. Outcast healers, forest witches, women who spoke to roots and ghosts and the dying wind, the kind his people had once hunted, then exiled when they refused to bend their powers to the pack's will. You're one of them, he said finally. A Venn witch. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't deny it. And you're an alpha without a pack seems we're both unwanted things. The words struck deeper than she likely intended. His pack, his brothers, his blood, gone because he'd trusted the wrong man. He looked away, the fire's glow burning against the raw edges of memory. Silence stretched between them again, taut as wire. Elara turned to the fire, stirring a small pot that filled the room with the scent of herbs and bone broth. Her hands moved with precision, the motions of someone who'd done this 1,000 times alone. You'll stay until your wounds close, she said finally, not looking at him. After that, you go. The forest doesn't need 2 ghosts haunting it. Kael's eyes lingered on her profile, on the scar that caught the light. He didn't argue. He couldn't. For now he was too weak to stand, too proud to thank her and too angry at himself for needing her at all. But deep inside, beneath the pain and pride, something else stirred. A faint, flickering curiosity. The storm had brought him to her door. And though the air between them was cold as the snow outside, Kael could already feel the dangerous warmth she carried in her silence. He didn't know it yet. But the forest had not saved him by chance. It had delivered him into the arms of the one person who could either heal him or destroy him completely. By morning, the cabin was veiled in a thin mist of dawn. Pale light filtered through the frost-bitten windows, washing everything in shades of silver and gray. The forest outside was silent, the kind of silence that came after a storm, where even the trees seemed to hold their breath. Kael was awake long before the sun rose. He lay still, staring at the wooden ceiling, his body heavy with pain and memory. Every breath drew the sharp taste of herbs and smoke. His wolf stirred restlessly inside him, impatient, caged. He hated this weakness, hated needing rest, hated her, the witch who'd kept him alive when all he'd wanted was to disappear into the snow and be forgotten. He swung his legs off the cot, ignoring the stab of agony that shot through his ribs. His feet hit the cold floorboards. Every muscle protested, but pride was stronger. He'd survived worse. He could stand. He had to. The door wasn't far. Beyond it waited the forest, endless, indifferent, merciful. But before he could take a step, a voice sliced through the silence. You're either brave, Elara said from the hearth, or an idiot. Kael turned his head, jaw tight. She was crouched near the fire, her long hair falling over her shoulder as she fed a log into the flames. The golden light caught on the strands, turning them to molten copper. I can walk, he muttered. You can bleed, she corrected. All over my floor, if you'd like. I could always use more wolf blood for my garden. The faintest ghost of a smirk touched her lips, but her eyes were hard, unreadable. Kael's voice dropped lower, rougher. You think I'm your prisoner? No, she said. I think you're a fool. The words stung more than they should have. She stood then, slowly, her movements graceful and deliberate, the kind of grace that came from surviving too many winters alone. "Sit down, Alpha," she said quietly. "You're not healed." He hated the command in her tone. He'd been the one who gave orders once. Warriors had bent the knee at his word. Now a witch, an exile, was speaking to him like he was some reckless cub. "Do not order me," he growled. "Then don't act like a child," she shot back. Her words cracked the air between them like lightning. Kael's eyes darkened, his wolf glinting behind them. "You forget who I am." Elara didn't step closer until the space between them was nothing but heat and defiance. "No, Alpha," she said softly. "I know exactly who you are, a man who lost everything, a leader without a pack, a beast trying to convince himself he still matters." Her voice was calm, but it struck him like claws. For a heartbeat he forgot to breathe. He saw it then, the flicker behind her gaze. Not cruelty, not mockery, understanding. She had been cast out too, broken in her own way. Still, pride refused to yield. "You talk too much, witch. And you listen too little, wolf." For a moment neither moved. The air thickened, charged with something neither of them could name. The fire popped, sending sparks between them like stars breaking apart. Kael's chest rose and fell, every breath a battle between fury and something deeper, something far more dangerous. Her scent was everywhere now, soft and wild, tangled with sage and frost. It pulled at him, clawed at him, even as his instincts screamed to keep distance. Elara broke the silence first. She brushed past him, close enough that he could feel the whisper of her hair against his arm. "If you're so determined to die," she said, her voice quieter now, "you can find the door yourself. I won't stop you again." Her steps echoed softly as she crossed to the far end of the cabin, but Kael didn't move. His hands clenched, his pulse thundered. He wanted to leave. Gods, he wanted to, but every time he breathed, the pain reminded him he wasn't ready. And every time he looked at her, that scar, those steady eyes, he felt something sharp twist in his chest. The silence stretched again, but it wasn't empty this time. It was heavy, humming, alive. Finally, Kael sank back onto the cot, dragging a shaky breath through clenched teeth. Elara didn't turn around. She simply reached for another jar of herbs and began to work again, as though the storm of words between them hadn't happened at all. Outside, snow began to fall again. Soft, slow, endless. Inside, the Alpha and the Outcast pretended not to notice that the world had already started to shift around them. The storm returned that night. The wind prowled through the forest like a living thing, scraping claws of ice against the cabin walls. The fire in the hearth burned low, throwing restless shadows that danced across the floorboards. Every few minutes the old beams creaked as though the house itself were holding its breath. Elara sat at her table, sorting herbs by candlelight. She'd been silent for hours. The rhythm of her work, crushing, stirring, pouring, was almost meditative. But beneath her calm, her thoughts churned. The Alpha's presence filled the cabin even when he said nothing. His breathing, steady now but heavy, echoed softly in the stillness. He had fallen into a restless half-sleep, though she could tell his instincts never fully allowed him to drift away. He was too used to danger, too used to betrayal, and so was she. She should have sent him away. The moment she'd seen the mark on his arm, the sigil of the Draven pack, carved in crimson ink, she should have let the snow claim him. That name carried blood and ruin wherever it went. Yet she hadn't. Because when she'd found him on her doorstep frozen and barely breathing, she had recognized the same emptiness she saw in herself every morning, the hollowness that came when everything you loved had already been taken. Her hand trembled as she tied a small bundle of dried sage. Behind her, Kael stirred. "You don't sleep?" His voice was gravel, half dreaming, half guarded. Elara didn't turn. "I sleep when the storm does." "Then you'll never rest," he murmured. A faint smile ghosted across her lips. "Rest is for those who believe tomorrow will be better than today." The silence that followed wasn't cold. It was thoughtful. heavy with unspoken things. Kael shifted again, wincing softly as his ribs protested. Elara's gaze flicked to him over her shoulder. Even in weakness, he looked dangerous, like a blade dulled by snow but never broken. "Your wounds need tending," she said finally. "I'll live." That wasn't a question. She rose before he could argue, moving to the shelf where she kept her salves. The candlelight traced the edges of her figure as she worked, the soft rustle of her robe whispering against the wood. Kael watched her approach uneasy. When she knelt beside him, her scent filled the air again. Earth and ash and something faintly floral, like the memory of a summer long gone. "Lift your arm," she said quietly. He hesitated, then obeyed. Her hands were small, but sure. She peeled away the old bandage, revealing angry red gashes along his ribs and shoulder. He caught the faint intake of her breath as she saw how deep they ran. "Silver," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "It burns longer than the wound itself." Kael's voice was low. "You know much about wounds like this. I've seen enough men bleed to learn something," she said. "Some deserved it, some didn't." Her fingers brushed against his skin as she applied the salve. The touch was cool, careful, but it sent a current through him all the same. He didn't flinch, though his jaw tightened. Her movements slowed, her eyes briefly catching the faint scars that crossed his chest. Old battles, old betrayals carved into flesh. "Who did this?" she asked softly, her tone shifting without her meaning to. "Does it matter?" he rasped. "It matters to the man who can't close his eyes without reliving it." Her words struck closer than he expected. Kael met her gaze. For the first time, there was no challenge in it, only silence. "They were my own," he said finally. "My blood, my kin. I trusted them to lead beside me. They trusted gold more than loyalty." Elara said nothing. She didn't look away either. Kael had been betrayed by those bound to him by oath. She had been cast out by those who should have protected her. Different scars. Same wound. She resumed her work, quieter now, her breath steady as she wrapped the clean bandage around his ribs. When she was done, she sat back on her heels and studied him. "You'll heal, but not if you keep tearing yourself open." Kael's lips twitched, almost a smile. "You lecture like an elder." "I've buried more years than you've lived, Wolf," he huffed softly. "You don't look it." That made her pause. For the first time, something uncertain flickered across her face, a fleeting warmth that she quickly hid behind practiced indifference. She began to rise, but Kael's hand shot out, catching her wrist. His touch was firm, not rough. Her pulse jumped beneath his fingers. "You have a scar," he said quietly, eyes tracing the faint mark that ran along her jaw. "Who gave it to you?" Elara froze. No one had asked that in years. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but her eyes were miles away. "The council," she said. "The day they banished me, said they couldn't burn me for what I'd done, so they marked me instead, so I'd never forget." Kael's grip loosened, but he didn't release her. "What did you do?" Her gaze met his. Calm, unflinching. "I saved someone the law said should die." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of 1,000 winters. For a long time, neither moved. The fire crackled softly, the wind howled, and something fragile began to take root between them, a shared silence that didn't feel like distance anymore. Kael's hand slid away. Elara stood slowly, her breath shaky. "You should rest," she said, but the command lacked its usual sharpness. Kael leaned back, eyes still on her. "Tell me your name." She hesitated. "You already know it." "I want to hear it from you." "Elara," she whispered. The name hung between them, soft and dangerous. A name the world had turned into a curse, now spoken like a vow. He said it once, quietly, tasting it like a secret. "Elara." Something shifted in the air. The storm outside grew wilder, but neither of them noticed. For the first time since the forest had swallowed his world, Kael didn't feel frozen. and for the first time since her exile, Elara didn't feel alone. The storm began as a whisper in the trees, an almost tender warning from the wind. By dusk it had grown into a roar that swallowed the forest whole. Snow came in furious waves, blanketing the world in silence so absolute it felt as though even time had stopped. The air outside the cabin turned cruel, the kind that froze breath mid-air and splintered tree limbs like brittle bones. Inside, the cabin shuddered under the weight of the blizzard. Every creak in the wood was a reminder of how fragile their little refuge truly was. Elara stood by the window, watching White swallow everything beyond the glass. Her reflection stared back at her, a ghost framed in frost. She had survived many winters alone, but this storm was different. It was relentless. And this time she was not alone. Behind her, Kael sat near the hearth, stripped down to his undershirt, one arm still bound tightly across his ribs. The firelight painted him in shades of amber and shadow. His wounds had begun to knit, but the exhaustion behind his eyes told her he was far from healed. Still staring at ghosts? His voice broke the hush, low and rough with fatigue. Elara didn't turn. If you mean the storm, it's very much alive. He gave a soft huff that might have been a laugh, or maybe a sigh. You sound like a woman who talks to the wind. I used to, she said, voice distant, before it stopped answering. Kael's gaze lingered on her back. Even wrapped in layers, she carried a kind of quiet strength that unsettled him. She was unlike anyone he'd ever known. Too honest for a witch, too sharp for a saint. He had seen healers before, dutiful, obedient, soft-spoken women who followed the rules of the packs. Elara was none of those things. Her defiance was quiet, but constant, like the heartbeat of the forest itself. Outside, the wind howled harder. Elara turned from the window and crossed to the fire, laying 2 more logs onto the fading embers. This won't last much longer, she murmured. The storm? The wood. She gestured to the small pile beside the hearth. I was saving what's left for the next few days, not one endless night. Kael frowned. How long do you think it'll last? She shook her head. This kind of storm doesn't follow time. It decides when to end. He studied her face, the set of her jaw, the calm control that never quite hid the flicker of worry beneath. You've lived through worse? Yes, she said softly, and I've buried what worse left behind. Her words silenced him. For a while only the fire spoke, crackling in quiet defiance of the cold pressing in from every corner. The cabin felt smaller tonight, the air heavy with warmth and unspoken thoughts. Kael's body ached. The wounds on his side throbbed, but something else gnawed at him too. The feeling of helplessness. An alpha confined to a healer's cabin, his strength stripped away by snow and pain. Every breath felt like a reminder of everything he'd lost. He clenched his jaw. I should be hunting, helping, doing something other than sitting here while you freeze together with me? She interrupted, her tone wry. He gave her a look, but she didn't flinch. You'd be dead before you reach the trees, she said simply. Even alphas can't fight nature. He didn't respond. He hated that she was right. Elara moved to the shelves and began sorting through jars. Roots, leaves, powders. She was careful, methodical, but he noticed the tension in her shoulders, the faint tremor in her hands. Supplies were running low. He could see it. When she returned to the table, she placed a small bundle of dried bark beside a bowl of melted snow. There's little left to eat. The storm's taken everything from the traps I set last week. Kael stared into the fire. You'll survive. Her brow lifted slightly. You sound certain of that. You've lasted this long, he said. You're too stubborn to die. Her lips curved faintly, though her eyes didn't soften. And you? You look ready to drop. He ignored her, but his body betrayed him. His hands trembled faintly as he reached for the cup she'd left him. His temperature had begun to dip again. He could feel it, the cold seeping into his bones, dull and merciless. Elara noticed. She always did. "You're burning and freezing at once," she said quietly. "Your body's fighting too hard." "I'll manage." "Not if you keep pretending you're invincible." Her tone was sharper now, but beneath it was something that sounded suspiciously like concern. He looked up, meeting her gaze. "You don't care what happens to me, witch." Her expression didn't change. "That's what I keep telling myself." The storm wailed through the chimney, drowning out the silence that followed. Hours passed. The night deepened, and the cold crept closer. Kael's breaths grew uneven. His lips had turned pale, his skin damp with fever. He tried to move closer to the fire, but his limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. Elara watched from across the room, every instinct in her screaming to stay detached, to let him survive or fail on his own. That was safer. That was what she'd learned. But then she heard it. The sound of his breathing, shallow and strained. The kind of sound that carried the weight of slipping life. Her pulse quickened. The fire's glow flickered low. The cabin seemed to darken with it. Elara rose slowly, crossing to where Kael sat slumped against the wall, his head bowed, breath misting faintly in the air. His skin was cold to the touch, his pulse faint beneath her fingertips. He was dying, not from his wounds, from the cold. She stared at him for a long moment, torn between reason and instinct. The storm outside screamed as though demanding a choice. Finally, she whispered to the quiet room, "Don't make me do this." But the storm didn't answer, and Kael didn't move. Elara exhaled slowly, a decision burning through her like a brand. Tomorrow would bring judgment, perhaps even regret. But tonight she would keep him alive. Even if it meant breaking every wall she had built around her heart. The blizzard grew merciless as night fell, the kind of cold that didn't just creep through walls but through bones, through breath, through the fragile barriers that separated the living from the dead. Elara had sealed every crack in the cabin with cloth and wax, but it wasn't enough. The wind found ways in, a whisper through the rafters, a hiss beneath the door, a voice that reminded her she was still alone. Kael lay on the bed of furs she'd made for him, his body shivering despite the fire's glow. His skin had turned a pallid shade of blue along the edges of his scars. Every breath came shallow, labored. The fever that had once burned in him had flipped to its cruel opposite. Now he was freezing from the inside out. She pressed her palm to his forehead. Ice. Her heart sank. No. Elara tore through her cupboards, herbs, roots, vials, anything that could rekindle warmth. But she knew the truth before her hands even stopped moving. No tincture or spell could fight this. His blood was slowing. The wolf inside him, the heartbeat that once thundered with life, was flickering to silence. Elara. His voice was a hoarse whisper. His eyes, once sharp and commanding, now looked clouded, almost pleading. "It's cold." She gritted her teeth, pushing another log into the fire. "You have to stay awake, Alpha, do you hear me?" He tried to smile. "Alpha, without a pack. You can just call me Kael." "Then stay alive, Kael." The flames offered light, not heat. The storm's breath pressed against the windows like a curse. She felt the world shrinking, the walls, the air, her hope. There was only one thing left she hadn't done. One thing no healer wanted to do unless desperate. The old magic. The magic of warmth sharing. An exchange of life through touch, body to body, heart to heart. It had saved men before, but it had destroyed just as many. It demanded balance. It demanded closeness. Her hands trembled. "No," she whispered to herself. "Not again." Kael's hand reached weakly toward her, missing her by inches. "Please," he murmured, breath barely fogging the air. "Just the tip." Her eyes widened. "What?" He swallowed hard, voice breaking. "Just the tip of warmth. I swear. Nothing more." The words cut through her like the strike of a bell. Desperate. Honest. Stripped bare of pride or command. It wasn't an alpha's demand. It was a dying man's plea. Elara knelt beside him, staring into his fading eyes. The snow outside screamed, battering the cabin like a warning. She could feel her pulse echoing his. Faint, irregular. If she hesitated longer, there would be no heartbeat left to find. She drew a breath, slow and shaking, and whispered, "Then forgive me for what I must do." The furs rustled as she eased beside him. Her fingers brushed his shoulder. His skin was cold as stone. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of her magic stir beneath her palms, a golden pulse that spread from her chest like a sigh. At first, nothing. Then a shiver. His body responding, instinctively seeking hers. She pressed closer, their breaths mingling in the dim firelight. "Don't fight it," she murmured. "Let the warmth in." His reply was barely a breath. "It's you." The air between them changed, not just warmer but charged. The storm outside roared, but inside it was as if time stilled. Every heartbeat she gave became his. Every tremor in her chest echoed in his veins. The cold receded inch by inch, replaced by a heat neither expected. Too alive, too human, too forbidden. Kael's eyes fluttered open, catching hers in the firelight. There was gratitude there, and something else. Something rawer, hungrier, unspoken. "Elara," he whispered. "Don't speak," she said, though her voice was softer than she intended. "It's only warmth, that's all." But when his trembling hand found hers, she didn't pull away. The air crackled between them. Warmth turned to fire. Fire turned to something that lived deeper, beyond spell or need. The storm outside raged until dawn, but they didn't notice when it began to ease. Only when the fire burned low did Elara pull away, breath unsteady, her cheeks flushed with more than heat. Kael's heartbeat had steadied. He slept now. Safe. Alive. Elara sat beside him long after, staring at the dying fire, her palms trembling. She had saved him. Yes. But something else had awakened in the dark. Something neither of them would ever be able to bury again. The first light of dawn was dim and blue, filtering weakly through frost-coated glass. The storm had finally broken. The forest outside lay still, buried under a vast white silence that stretched to the horizon. No wind, no howling, only the distant creak of trees bowed under snow. Inside the cabin, the world felt smaller, too quiet, too fragile. Elara stirred before Kael did. For a moment she forgot. The weight of his arm resting loosely against her waist, the steady warmth at her back that wasn't hers alone. Her body was still humming from the night's magic, but when memory returned, it did so like a knife drawn slow. She sat up sharply, clutching the furs around her. Her pulse raced. She could still feel the echo of his heartbeat tangled with hers. The rhythm that had once slowed toward death now strong again. Because of her. Because of them. Elara rose quickly, as if distance could undo what had been done. She went to the fire, feeding it with trembling hands. The air was still cold, but not unbearably so. Her own warmth seemed to linger in the walls, in the air itself, a lingering proof that her forbidden power had worked. Behind her, Kael stirred. His breath came steady, his body no longer trembled. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse but alive. "You saved me." Elara didn't turn. "Don't thank me." He shifted against the furs, the sound of movement too human, too near. "Then what should I say? That it won't happen again?" Kael was silent for a moment. "What did you do to me?" "I gave you warmth," she said flatly. Nothing more. A soft, humorless sound escaped him. Not quite laughter, not quite disbelief. "Nothing more?" Her jaw tightened. "You were dying. I did what was necessary." He studied her, his eyes sharper now, the wolf in him awake again. "And you expect me to believe that what happened between us was just necessity?" Her fingers froze around the fire poker. She turned at last to face him, the glow from the flames drawing gold across her pale skin. Her eyes shadowed, guarded. "Believe what you like. You're healed now. That's all that matters. Kael sat up slowly. The movement made the blanket slip, revealing the scars along his chest, the faint shimmer of magic still woven into them like threads of light. He didn't bother to cover them. Instead, he watched her, his expression unreadable. "Where I come from," he said quietly. "A healer who gives warmth binds herself to the life she saves. It's called a blood debt." Elara's voice went soft, dangerous. "Then where you come from no longer matters. Your pack is gone." The words hit harder than she intended. His gaze flickered, shadow crossing his features. For a long time he said nothing. Then quietly he murmured, "So is yours." The silence that followed was thick enough to drown in. Elara turned away first, gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles whitened. "Rest. You'll need your strength when the snow clears." Kael's tone shifted. Lower now. Not a command, not even a question. Something else. "And when it does, will you cast me out again?" "I should," she whispered, "but I don't know if I can." Her voice broke on the last word. She hated it. The tremor, the truth in it. Kael rose, unsteady but defiant. "You gave me warmth, Elara. You can pretend it was just survival, but you and I both know. Something else woke in that fire." Her eyes met his then, sharp and shining with something between anger and ache. "Don't mistake magic for meaning, Alpha." He took a step closer. "And don't mistake fear for wisdom, witch." The word once used to wound her now came out softer, almost reverent. It made her breath catch despite herself. Before either could speak again, a sound shattered the fragile moment, the distant echo of a howl. Faint, but close. Not the storm's cry this time. A wolf's. Kael turned toward the sound, instinct flashing in his eyes. "They found me." Elara's stomach sank. The world outside might have gone still, but the danger had not passed. The storm had only hidden it, she whispered. "Then the warmth you asked for may be the last piece you ever get." Kael's gaze lingered on her, heavy, unreadable. "Not if you stand with me." But Elara said nothing. Not yet. Outside, the snow began to shift again. Quiet, patient, waiting. Inside, the warmth they'd shared burned on, unspoken but alive, fragile as flame. The storm had passed, but peace did not follow. Kael slept, though his body did not rest. The cabin was quiet. Too quiet. Save for the soft crackle of the hearth and the whisper of Elara's quill as she wrote by candlelight. She had not dared to sleep since the night she'd given him warmth. Something in the air between them had changed, fragile as glass, dangerous as a secret neither wanted to speak aloud. Outside, the forest glimmered under moonlight. Inside, Kael's breath came uneven, shallow gasps caught between growls, his fingers twitching against the furs. Then came the sound. A low, strangled snarl. Elara's head lifted sharply. The candle flickered as the temperature dropped. The scent of frost and iron, the scent of blood, filled the air. Kael's body convulsed once, twice. Then he murmured a name she didn't know. Ryan. His voice cracked on the word, as though it were a wound reopening. Elara rose and approached his bedside. His face was pale, slick with cold sweat, his jaw clenched tight as if fighting unseen chains. She knelt beside him, hesitant but drawn by something she couldn't name. "Kael," she whispered. "You're safe. It's over." But he didn't hear her. His body flinched again, and from his throat came a sound that wasn't quite human, the cry of a wolf bound by grief. Elara reached for his hand. It was trembling, cold, despite the fire. Instinct overrode caution. She closed her eyes and placed her other hand over his heart. Her pulse steadied. Her magic stirred. At first she only meant to soothe him, to ease the pain of memory, to calm the storm that still raged inside him. But as her power flowed through the contact, images surged up from the depths of his dream, vivid, raw, unstoppable. She gasped, Suddenly she wasn't in the cabin anymore. She was standing in a snowfield drenched in moonlight. The air was thick with the scent of steel and blood. Wolves lay scattered across the white expanse, Kael's pack, their bodies broken, their eyes glassy with betrayal. The mark of their crest burned faintly on their armor, the crescent fang, and at the center of it all stood Kael, younger, his eyes fierce, his blade dripping crimson. Across from him, another wolf stood, taller, colder, his beta. Ryan, Kael growled, voice shaking with disbelief. You stood beside me. You swore your loyalty before the moon's flame. Ryan's reply was quiet, almost pitying. The world changes, Kael. The Shadow Court promised what you never could. A future. Kael's answer came with a roar that shook the snow from the trees. At the cost of our honor, of our kin. Ryan's blade flashed. The memory shattered into chaos. Wolves screaming, snow turning red. The crack of magic colliding with steel. Elara felt every heartbeat, every death cry, as if they were her own. She saw Kael fall to his knees, surrounded by the ghosts of his pack, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Forgive me." The vision dissolved like smoke. Elara jerked back, gasping, her hand slipping from his chest. Her body trembled, her breath coming fast. She had not meant to see so much and only to help, but the bond between them had opened wider than she'd ever intended. Kael stirred, his eyes snapping open, gold flickered in them. The wolf within half awake, half wild. Elara. His voice was low, dangerous. What did you do? She froze. The truth hung between them like frost. I tried to ease your pain, she whispered. You were inside my head. His tone was sharp now, every word edged with fury. He sat up, the furs falling from his chest, muscles tensing as if ready for a fight. You saw it, didn't you? Elara's throat tightened. I didn't mean to. Then you should have stopped. He growled, eyes burning with a wounded kind of rage. Those memories were not yours to touch. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The air thickened, the warmth of the fire swallowed by the cold rising between them. Elara took a step back, the shame already sinking deep. I'm sorry, she said, barely a whisper. I only wanted to help. Kael turned away, jaw tight, the scars on his back stark in the firelight. Then you should have let me dream. Outside, a wind rose again, stirring the ashes of the storm. Inside, silence fell, heavier than before, filled with everything they couldn't say. Elara didn't look back when she fled the cabin. The door slammed behind her, the sound swallowed by the forest's heavy silence. The snow was deep, untouched since the storm, and each step she took sank into it like a confession. Soft, fleeting, impossible to erase. The cold bit at her skin, but she didn't care. The shame burned hotter. Her magic had always been a fragile thing, wild and living, bound more by instinct than control. She had learned to heal, to soothe, but never to look where she wasn't invited. Yet something about Kael, his pain, his fury, his loneliness, had pulled her in before she could stop herself. Now she wished she had. She stopped beneath the trees, leaning against the trunk of an old pine, her breath fogging the air. The forest around her felt hollow. She could still hear the echo of his voice. Those memories were not yours to touch. Elara pressed her palm to her chest. Through her skin she could still feel the echo of what she'd seen, the heartbreak of betrayal, the sight of Kael on his knees in the snow, surrounded by the bodies of those he had sworn to protect. The pain wasn't hers, but it lingered inside her all the same, heavy as guilt. She whispered to the empty forest, I only wanted to help. A branch cracked behind her. She turned sharply, expecting danger, but it was only Kael standing a few paces away. He hadn't dressed fully, his breath visible in the cold, the edges of the furs still wrapped around his shoulders. His eyes were dark, no longer furious, just tired. Elara, he said quietly. She took a step back. You shouldn't be out here. You're not fully recovered. He ignored that. Why did you follow the pain? Her throat tightened. Because it called to me. Kael frowned. Called? You were trapped in it, she said, voice shaking. It wasn't just a dream, Kael. It was drowning you. I felt it. The guilt, the loss. It was louder than the storm. He looked away, his jaw hardening. You don't understand. Those memories are all that's left of my pack. If I let them fade, then so do they. Elara stepped closer, slowly. Holding pain doesn't honor the dead. It only kills what's still alive in you. Kael's gaze flicked to hers, not angry this time, but searching. You think I don't know that? I think you don't want to know it. Her words hung there. Fragile, dangerous. For a long time, neither spoke. Snow fell lightly through the branches, whispering between them like the ghosts of the past. Then Kael sighed. A sound like surrender. You saw everything, didn't you? The battlefield. The betrayal. Yes, she whispered. Your beta, the shadow court. Something flickered behind his eyes. Pain, shame, maybe even relief that someone else finally knew. He moved to a fallen log and sat, elbows resting on his knees. Ryan was like a brother to me. I trusted him more than my own blood. I would have died for him. He paused, breath visible in the air. In the end, I almost did. Elara's heart ached at the quiet in his voice. You still dream of him. Every night. The silence that followed wasn't cold anymore. It was heavy, yes, but softer somehow. Shared. After a long moment, Kael spoke again, his tone rough. When I woke and felt you in my mind, it wasn't anger I felt first. It was fear. Fear? He nodded slowly. Because you saw me as I am, not the alpha, not the wolf. Just the man who failed his pack. Elara knelt before him, the snow dampening her cloak. Then maybe that's who you were meant to be seen as. He looked up at her, eyes gold and human all at once. You don't understand. In my world, an alpha doesn't show weakness. He carries it alone, until it breaks him. Then let it break, she said softly. That's how something stronger can grow in its place. Kael stared at her for a long time. The wind moved between them, cold but no longer cruel. Then, without another word, he lowered his head, just slightly, as if in quiet acknowledgement of the truth she'd spoken. For the first time since she'd met him, Elara didn't see the beast or the alpha. She saw a man trying to hold together the pieces of a soul too heavy with ghosts. You said? Elara didn't look back when she fled the cabin. The door slammed behind her, the sound swallowed by the forest's heavy silence. The snow was deep, untouched since the storm, and each step she took sank into it like a confession. Soft, fleeting, impossible to erase. The cold bit at her skin, but she didn't care. The shame burned hotter. Her magic had always been a fragile thing, wild and living, bound more by instinct than control. She had learned to heal, to soothe, but never to look where she wasn't invited. Yet something about Kael, his pain, his fury, his loneliness, had pulled her in before she could stop herself. Now she wished she had. She stopped beneath the trees, leaning against the trunk of an old pine, her breath fogging the air. The forest around her felt hollow. She could still hear the echo of his voice. Those memories were not yours to touch. Elara pressed her palm to her chest. Through her skin she could still feel the echo of what she'd seen. The heartbreak of betrayal. The sight of Kael on his knees in the snow, surrounded by the bodies of those he had sworn to protect. The pain wasn't hers, but it lingered inside her all the same, heavy as guilt. She whispered to the empty forest, I only wanted to help. A branch cracked behind her. She turned sharply, expecting danger. But it was only Kael, standing a few paces away. He hadn't dressed fully, his breath visible in the cold, the edges of the furs still wrapped around his shoulders. His eyes were dark, no longer furious, just tired. Elara, he said quietly. She took a step back. You shouldn't be out here. You're not fully recovered. He ignored that. Why did you follow the pain? Her throat tightened. Because it called to me. Kael frowned. Called? You were trapped in it, she said, voice shaking. It wasn't just a dream, Kael. It was drowning you. I felt it, the guilt, the loss. It was louder than the storm. He looked away, his jaw hardening. You don't understand. Those memories are all that's left of my pack. If I let them fade, then so do they. Elara stepped closer, slowly. Holding pain doesn't honor the dead. It only kills what's still alive in you. Kael's gaze flicked to hers. Not angry this time, but searching. You think I don't know that? I think you don't want to know it. Her words hung there, fragile, dangerous. For a long time, neither spoke. Snow fell lightly through the branches, whispering between them like the ghosts of the past. Then Kael sighed, a sound like surrender. You saw everything, didn't you? The battlefield, the betrayal. Yes, she whispered. Your beta, the shadow court. Something flickered behind his eyes. Pain, shame, maybe even relief that someone else finally knew. He moved to a fallen log and sat, elbows resting on his knees. Ryan was like a brother to me. I trusted him more than my own blood. I would have died for him. He paused, breath visible in the air. In the end, I almost did. Ilara's heart ached at the quiet in his voice. You still dream of him. Every night. The silence that followed wasn't cold anymore. It was heavy, yes, but softer somehow, shared. After a long moment, Kael spoke again, his tone rough. When I woke and felt you in my mind, it wasn't anger I felt first. It was fear. Fear? He nodded slowly. Because you saw me as I am, not the Alpha, not the wolf, just the man who failed his pack. Elara knelt before him, the snow dampening her cloak. Then maybe that's who you were meant to be seen as. He looked up at her, eyes gold and human all at once. You don't understand. In my world, an Alpha doesn't show weakness. He carries it alone until it breaks him. Then let it break, she said softly. That's how something stronger can grow in its place. Kael stared at her for a long time. The wind moved between them, cold, but no longer cruel. Then, without another word, he lowered his head, just slightly, as if in quiet acknowledgement of the truth she'd spoken. For the first time since she'd met him, Elara didn't see the beast or the Alpha. She saw a man trying to hold together the pieces of a soul too heavy with ghosts. The silence between them stretched, fragile but alive, like the thin ice of a thawing river. One wrong word could shatter it. Yet for once, neither wanted to move away. Elara watched him from where she knelt in the snow, the color of her cloak blending into the white world around them. Kael sat motionless, his hands clasped loosely, gaze distant, as if the ghosts of his fallen pack lingered just beyond the tree line. The air smelled of pine and cold ash. Somewhere above, a crow called once and vanished into the gray sky. After a long while, Kael spoke again, his voice low. The night Ryan betrayed us, the moon was red. The elders used to say it was a sign of blood debt, a bond broken by greed. His jaw flexed. He didn't just kill my pack. He sold them to the Shadow Court in exchange for power. Elara's heart twisted. She'd heard stories of the Shadow Court, the half-seen rulers of the old world, where shadows were currency and hearts were collateral. Few who crossed them survived. Fewer still spoke of it. Kael looked down at his hands. There were faint scars on his knuckles, old but deep. When the court came, we fought. My wolves. They died believing I'd protect them. But I failed. I was blinded by loyalty, by the illusion that Ryan still stood beside me. Elara rose to her feet and stepped closer. The snow crunched under her boots. You can't keep carrying their deaths as a punishment, Kael. His head lifted slightly, gold eyes glinting with the sharpness of old grief. Then what am I supposed to carry, healer? Their memory deserves more than peace. Peace isn't forgetting, she said quietly. It's remembering without letting it devour you. He looked at her for a long time, the wind stirring his hair. Then slowly, Kael reached up and pulled aside the edge of his fur mantle. Beneath it, along his shoulder and down his arm, ran a latticework of scars, claw marks, burns, wounds too deep to have come from a single battle. "They marked me," he said. "The quartz fire doesn't just burn the body, it burns the soul." Elara stepped closer, her breath catching. The scars glowed faintly under the thin winter light, not with magic but with something deeper. Memory made flesh. She hesitated before reaching out, fingers trembling. "May I?" Kael didn't speak, but he didn't pull away. Her fingertips brushed his skin, tracing the ridges with the gentleness of someone touching a story rather than a wound. The heat that rose between them wasn't from the air. It was from the pulse beneath his skin, steady, alive, defiant. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "You survived more than most could bear." He huffed a quiet breath that might have been a laugh or a sigh. "Survival isn't victory." "No," she agreed. "But it's the beginning of one." Kyle's eyes lifted to hers, something unspoken flickering there. Not gratitude, not yet forgiveness, but the first fragile spark of trust, the kind that had to be earned through silence, not promises. The wind shifted, carrying a hint of thaw in its breath. Snow began to melt on the lower branches, dripping like the forest itself was exhaling after too long a hold. He reached out, not to touch her, but to rest his hand over hers, still lingering near his scars. His palm was rough, her skin chilled, yet the contact felt like a truce. Not of words, but of acknowledgement. "I don't know how to let go," he said quietly. Elara looked up at him, eyes soft. "Then don't. Just stop holding on so tightly." For a heartbeat, the world held still. The wind, the falling snow, even the ache between them. Then Kael stood, the weight of his past still on his shoulders, but lighter now, as if some invisible chain had loosened. He offered her his hand. "Come," he said. "You'll freeze out here." Elara hesitated, not because of the cold, but because she knew the gesture meant more than shelter. It was trust, extended from a man who had lost everything, and in taking it she was accepting not just his warmth but his scars, his ghosts, his unfinished grief. She placed her hand in his. Together they walked back toward the cabin, two broken souls bound not by destiny, but by the fragile courage of being seen. And for the first time since the storm began, Kael didn't look over his shoulder at the shadows of the past. He walked beside them. The days that followed unfolded like slow breaths after a long cry. The snow still clung to the forest, but its edges began to soften beneath the reluctant touch of sunlight. Icicles wept from the cabin roof, dripping steadily onto the worn wooden steps. The world had not yet thawed, but it had begun to remember how. Inside, the cabin felt different. The air no longer carried the sharp scent of blood and fear, but of simmering herbs, pine resin, and warmth. The silence between Elara and Kael had changed too, no longer edged with suspicion, but layered with something quieter, something alive. They worked side by side in a rhythm neither spoke of but both understood. When Elara ground roots and brewed poultices, Kael fetched water from the frozen stream, breaking the surface ice with steady blows of his axe. When he mended the broken shutters, she brought him thread and nails from the carved chest in the corner. Sometimes they spoke, soft, practical words about weather or work. But mostly, they didn't need to. Their silence had become its own language. Kael moved through the cabin with a stillness that belonged to someone used to command but unaccustomed to peace. He repaired what was broken with deliberate hands, the cracked table leg, the loose latch on the door, the leaky roof above the hearth. It wasn't duty that drove him anymore, but the quiet desire to give something back to the one who had saved him. Elara, watching him from across the small room, often caught herself forgetting who he was, the Alpha who had survived betrayal and fire. In those moments he was only a man with kind eyes and a guarded heart, carrying wood in from the cold and leaving small trails of melting snow behind him. At dusk, they would share a meal, simple broth, sometimes bread, sometimes just tea, brewed from frost mint and willow bark. Elara would hum old forest songs under her breath, songs from before her banishment. Kael never joined, but she could feel his gaze when she sang, heavy, quiet, reverent, as though each note was a memory he wasn't ready to claim. On the 5th morning, Elara woke to find Kael already outside. The storm had cleared, and the sky shone pale blue over the white horizon. He was gathering firewood, his breath fogging in the air, his movements smooth and sure. She stood in the doorway for a moment, arms wrapped around herself, watching him. The sight stirred something she hadn't felt in years, a small, cautious spark of safety. Not just because he was strong, but because he was still there. He hadn't left after healing, as she'd expected. He stayed. When Kael noticed her, he gave a small nod. Not a smile, but something close. "The forest's thawing," he said. "Tracks are returning. I can hunt again soon." Elara nodded. "Be careful near the ravine. The snow's unstable there." A pause, then softer. "Thank you." He looked surprised. "For what?" "For mending the cabin. For staying." Kael's gaze softened, though his tone remained steady. "You gave me warmth when I didn't deserve it. Fixing a few boards is nothing." Elara turned back toward the fire, though her lips curved faintly. "You say that like it's easy to repay kindness." "It's not," he murmured, "but it's a start." The day passed in quiet labor. By evening, the sky burned gold and rose through the frost-laced pines. The forest, once suffocating in its silence, now pulsed faintly with life. The rustle of distant wings, the first timid crack of thawing ice. Elara sat by the hearth, sorting herbs, while Kael returned with a small catch, 2 rabbits and a handful of wild roots. When he stepped into the cabin, shaking off snow, she felt the cold roll off him like mist, followed by the faint grounding scent of pine and smoke. He placed the catch beside her table. "It's not much, but it'll last." She looked up, smiling gently. "It's more than enough." Their eyes met across the dim room. Not long, just long enough to feel the shift between them. The space that had once been filled with fear now held something new. Not yet love, not yet trust, but the first warmth that flickered between loneliness and belonging. As night deepened, Kael sat by the fire to mend his blade, and Elara returned to her herbs. The flames painted their faces in hues of amber and gold, softening edges, revealing quiet truths neither dared to speak aloud. The storm outside had ended, but within the cabin, another kind had begun. Not of wind and ice, but of 2 souls learning to exist in the same fragile peace. The thaw came slowly, as if the forest itself were learning to breathe again. Each morning the snow receded a little farther from the roots of the trees, and the river, once frozen silent, began to murmur beneath its crust of ice. Inside the cabin, time lost its sharpness. Days blurred into one another, marked not by calendars or moons, but by the small rituals that now filled their lives. Kael would rise before dawn to split wood, his breath fogging in the pale light. Elara would light the fire, brew tea, and set herbs to dry along the rafters. They moved around each other with a quiet rhythm that needed no instruction. There was comfort in the routine, a fragile, human peace neither of them had expected to find. One evening, when the forest turned blue with twilight, Kael returned from hunting with a faint smile ghosting his lips. He carried a pair of pheasants and a bundle of dried moss for Elara's salves. She met him at the door, brushing the snow from his shoulders. The gesture was automatic, instinctive, and for a heartbeat, their hands lingered. "Your aim's improving," she said softly. "Your herbs help," he replied. "I don't tire as easily now." Elara stepped back, nodding toward the fire. "Sit. Warm yourself." As he did, she busied herself with the pot over the hearth. The scent of simmering broth filled the cabin, mingling with the sharp, clean smell of pine. Kael's gaze followed her movements, the way her fingers brushed the wooden spoon, the faint light catching on the strands of her hair. There was strength in her stillness, the kind that came from surviving when the world had already decided you shouldn't. When the food was ready, they sat across from each other on the floor by the fire. The flames painted their faces in shades of gold and amber, softening the shadows beneath their eyes. Kael spoke first. You live out here alone. You hunt, you heal, you survive. But why here? Why so far from the others? Elara hesitated. Her spoon stilled. For a moment she seemed to weigh the words. Then she exhaled slowly. Because I wasn't welcome anywhere else. Kael's brow furrowed. The banishment. She nodded. You've guessed that much. He said nothing, letting the quiet draw her forward. Elara's voice softened, almost like she was speaking to the fire rather than him. There was an alpha once. Not you, not your kind. A cursed one. His wolf had turned feral. His blood carried darkness. The healers said he was beyond saving, that the curse was the god's punishment. But I couldn't just let him die. So I tried. She paused, eyes fixed on the dancing flames. I used forbidden magic, the kind that takes a piece of what's living to mend what's dying. It didn't work. He died anyway, and when the elders found out, they called it corruption. They said I had tried to raise what should have been left to the earth. Kael listened without interrupting. His face was still, but his eyes were full of something deep. Recognition, perhaps even understanding. They cast me out, she continued. Told me my touch would bring ruin. I wandered for months. I built this cabin because I had nowhere else to go. She gave a small, brittle laugh. Sometimes I think the forest kept me alive out of pity. Kael's jaw tightened, but his voice was steady. You weren't punished for failure, you were punished for compassion. Elara's gaze flicked to him, startled, then softened. You sound certain. I am, he said quietly, because I've seen real corruption. It wears ambition, not mercy. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't empty. It was full of things neither could quite say. The air between them felt alive, charged with the quiet understanding of two people who had both been cast out by the worlds they tried to save. Elara looked down at her hands. I failed him, Kael, and part of me fears I'll fail again. Kael's voice was gentle, almost a growl beneath the warmth. You didn't fail me. Her breath caught. You don't know that yet. I do, he said, because I should have died that night in the snow. But I didn't. I'm still here. Their eyes met across the firelight, his gold, hers silver green, reflecting the same unspoken ache. It was not yet love, but it was something that carried its shape, quiet, fierce, and born of shared ruin. Elara looked away first. You should sleep, she murmured, rising to take the pot from the fire. Kael didn't argue, but as he lay down on the furs near the hearth, watching her move through the dim glow, he realized something had changed. The cabin no longer felt like a place of exile. It felt like home, fragile, fleeting, but real. And as he drifted into uneasy dreams, he thought he heard her voice through the darkness, soft, like the forest's whisper. Even wolves deserve warmth. The nights grew softer after that. The snow melted completely from the eaves and the forest awoke in small, quiet ways. The trickle of water beneath moss, the distant cry of a nightbird, the scent of thawed earth. Inside the cabin, the fire burned lower but warmer. It no longer fought the cold. It held it gently at bay. Kael's strength returned faster than Elara expected. The wolf in him healed quickly, but the man, the part buried beneath duty and regret, took longer. He still woke from dreams, sometimes gasping, sometimes silent. On those nights, Elara would rise without a word and light another candle. She didn't touch him. She simply sat nearby until the trembling in his breath eased. That unspoken rhythm between them deepened. Not romance yet, but something older, quieter. Trust. One evening, a soft rain began to fall, pattering gently against the roof. Kael was mending a broken snare by the hearth while Elara sorted her herbs nearby. Every so often their eyes met, and the silence filled with things neither dared name. You still keep your distance, Kael said after a while, not looking up. Elara's fingers paused on the bundle of sage. Habit. From fear? He asked. She gave a faint, wistful smile. From memory. Every time I care for someone, it ends in loss. Kael set the snare aside. You think caring is what curses you? Isn't it? She whispered. I cared for the cursed Alpha. I cared for the healers who cast me out, and She stopped herself, the rest caught in her throat. Kael stood, crossing the small space between them. And you care for me. It wasn't a question. The rain outside grew heavier, the sound steady and soft. The fire cracked, sending sparks upward. Elara's heartbeat filled her ears. She didn't move, didn't speak, because denial would have been a lie. Kael's voice was low, roughened by honesty. You gave me back my breath, my body, my will to live. I thought I was nothing but a ghost in a wolf's skin, but you... His voice caught. You looked at me and saw something worth saving. Her throat tightened. You were worth saving. He smiled faintly. A rare, almost fragile thing. Then let me thank you properly. Elara's breath hitched as he reached out, his hand hovering just above her cheek, waiting. She didn't pull away. The warmth of his palm brushed her skin, and for a heartbeat, the world held still. No curses, no exile, no ghosts, only the soft rhythm of rain and fire. Kael, she whispered, though she wasn't sure if it was a plea or a warning. But then his lips found hers. Slow, uncertain at first, like a secret afraid of being spoken. The kiss deepened gently, as if both feared the moment might break if they held it too tightly. Her hands rose to his chest, feeling the steady beat beneath her fingers, the heat of him. It wasn't hunger that guided them, but the quiet ache of two lost souls finding warmth in the same flame. When they finally parted, the silence was thick with everything unspoken. Kael rested his forehead against hers. You healed more than my wounds, Elara, he murmured, and that terrifies me. She smiled faintly, tears shining like dew in her lashes. Then we're both terrified. He laughed softly, the first real laugh she'd ever heard from him. It was low and rough, but it carried something bright. He touched her cheek again, as though memorizing her face by the flicker of firelight. Outside, the rain slowed to a whisper. Inside, two broken hearts finally remembered how to beat in rhythm, and as the last ember cracked in the hearth, Elara thought that maybe, just maybe, the gods had not abandoned her after all. They had simply waited for her to find him. The peace didn't shatter all at once. It cracked, quietly, like ice underfoot. A sound easy to miss if you weren't listening. Kael heard it first. He had risen before dawn, as he often did, to fetch water from the stream beyond the trees. The forest still wore its veil of mist, the kind that turned every branch into a ghost and every sound into a secret. The air was damp, thick with the scent of pine and thawing earth, but beneath it, faint, distant, something else lingered. Wolf. Not the wild kind, nor the scent of passing beasts. This was sharper, colder, laced with metal and magic. It carried intent, a mark of the Shadow Court's hunters. Kael froze mid-step, every instinct in him shifting. His hand went to the knife at his belt, but he didn't draw it, not yet. He lifted his head slightly, inhaling deeper. 2 of them. Maybe 3. Passing through the outer wood. Scouts. His pulse quickened, though his face remained calm. It had been months since he'd last caught that scent, the stench of betrayal that haunted his nightmares. The same scent that clung to the battlefield where his pack had fallen. The court had found him. Or at least they were close enough to smell his ghost. By the time he returned to the cabin, his boots were heavy with mud, and the mist clung to his cloak like smoke. Elara was already awake, kneeling by the fire as she ground herbs in a small stone bowl. She looked up when he entered, eyes soft with the warmth that always met him now. But her smile faded the moment she saw his face. "What is it?" she asked, setting the pestle down. Kael's gaze flicked to the window, to the line of trees beyond. "We're not alone." Elara straightened slowly. "How close?" "Too close," he said. "Scouts from the Shadow Court. They're tracking something. Or someone. Likely me. She moved to the window, pressing her palm against the wood. Her magic rippled faintly, a shimmer that spread outward, brushing against the edges of her protective ward. Her brow furrowed. The barrier's thinning, she whispered. I felt it last night, but I thought it was the storm. It's not the storm, Kael said grimly. They've found my scent. Elara turned back to him, the light of the fire catching in her eyes. Then we strengthen the spell. I can reinforce it. Kael shook his head. No, if the court's scouts are this close, the main pack won't be far behind. Reinforcing the barrier will draw their attention. They'll sense the surge of magic. Then what do you suggest? She asked, voice rising. That we hide, wait until they burn the forest to find you? His jaw tightened. No. I'll lead them away. They want me, not you. The words hit her like a slap. You'll leave? I'll draw them from the woods, he said firmly. By the time they realize they've lost the trail, you'll have enough time to... No. Elara's voice cut through his like a blade. You're not strong enough yet. You can fight, yes, but not an entire hunting pack. You won't make it through the pass alive. He looked at her then. Really looked. At the stubborn set of her jaw, the tremor in her hands that betrayed her fear. I've faced worse. Not alone, she said, stepping closer. Not this time. Kael's eyes softened, but only slightly. You don't understand what they'll do to anyone who stands between us. They'll mark you as traitor in, or worse. Elara met his gaze, unflinching. Then let them come. I've lived with exile once. I can do it again. Her defiance stirred something dangerous in him. Not anger exactly, but something raw and protective. The alpha in him rose, the instinct that demanded obedience, safety, control. It pulsed under his skin like heat. Elara, he said, voice low, warning, you don't know the kind of monsters they are. She took another step forward, her chin lifting. And you don't know the kind of witch I've become. The air between them sparked, tension and fear, and something deeper, hungrier, threading through every word. His wolf strained beneath the surface, caught between the urge to shield her and the need to make her understand, but she stood her ground, eyes bright and fierce. Please, he said, softer this time. Don't make me choose between protecting you and running from them. You already made that choice, she whispered, the moment you decided I wasn't strong enough to stand beside you. For a long, trembling moment, neither of them moved. The fire crackled. Outside, the forest held its breath. Kael's hands clenched at his sides. You don't understand. No, she cut in, voice shaking but steady. You don't understand. Every time I try to save something, it leaves. I won't watch you disappear into that storm again. Her words broke something in him. That careful, self-imposed distance he'd held between them. He wanted to argue, to command her to stay hidden. But the look in her eyes, the fierce, aching loyalty, silenced him. He turned away before she could see the conflict tearing through him. Outside, somewhere beyond the trees, a wolf howled, distant, haunting, familiar. The shadow court was closing in, and inside the fragile safety of that cabin, Kael and Elara both knew. Their peace had reached its end. The storm rolled in without warning, not the kind that fell from the sky. This one brewed between them, unseen, electric. Elara moved past Kael, her cloak brushing his arm as she reached for the bowl of crushed herbs on the table. Her fingers trembled, but her voice was steady. If you're set on leaving, at least let me prepare something to strengthen your wounds. Kael's hand shot out, catching her wrist before she could move farther. No, he said, his tone sharp, more command than request. She froze, staring down at his grip. Not harsh, but unyielding. You don't get to tell me what I can or can't do in my own home. His eyes burned gold in the firelight. If I stay, you'll die. If I go, maybe you live. That's not a choice I'm giving you, Elara. It's the only way. And if I say I won't let you go? she whispered. He hesitated, his fingers still wrapped around her pulse. The silence stretched, taut and trembling. Then he released her, stepping back like a man afraid of his own hands. "Elara," he said quietly, "you don't know what I've done. The court won't stop. Not until every drop of blood they spilled that night is repaid." "I do know," she snapped, spinning toward him. "I've seen it, and remember? Your memories, your pain. You think that makes you the only one haunted?" He turned his head away, jaw tightening. "You don't understand what it means to be hunted, don't I?" Her voice cracked, low and fierce. "I was banished for saving a life. I've lived every day since knowing that if I step 1 foot beyond these woods, I'll be killed on sight. You think exile makes you special, Alpha? I've been living it since before your pack fell." The words hit him like claws across his chest. His wolf stirred. Not in anger this time, but in recognition. In shame. He took a slow step toward her. "You shouldn't have to pay for my ghosts. And you shouldn't have to face yours alone." Her defiance was a spark to dry tinder. The air between them thickened, the pull of their connection stronger than either of them wanted to admit. Kael's breathing deepened, rough and uneven. Elara's heart hammered in her chest, her magic reacting to him like a current drawn to flame. "Why do you care?" he asked finally, his voice a rasp. "Why risk yourself for me?" Elara's gaze didn't falter. "Because I see the man who still believes he can save what's left of his soul, and because I refuse to lose another life to the cold." Kael's restraint snapped. He closed the distance between them in a heartbeat, his hand finding her cheek, his breath mixing with hers, his body trembling with everything he couldn't say. The air was hot and cold all at once, the fire roaring behind them, like it too had been waiting for this. "Elara," he murmured, her name breaking against his throat like a confession. Her lips parted, but no words came, only the tremor of breath between them. "You call me witch," she whispered finally, voice trembling. "But it's you who cast the spell." Then the world broke open, their mouths met. Not gentle, not tentative, desperate. Fire and frost colliding, all the unspoken fear and fury burning into something that had no name. His hands tangled in her hair, hers clutched his shirt, dragging him closer, until there was no space left for words or doubt. The storm outside howled. Inside, the fire burned hotter. It wasn't love, fire and frost colliding, all the unspoken fear and fury burning into something that had no name. His hands tangled in her hair, hers clutched his shirt, dragging him closer until there was no space left for words or doubt. The storm outside howled. Inside, the fire burned hotter. It wasn't love, not yet. It was survival, raw, human, and necessary. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless, their foreheads pressed together, hearts still racing like hunted things. Kael's voice came first, low and rough. "They'll come for me soon." Elara's reply was barely a whisper. "Then let them. I won't let them take you." He smiled faintly, not out of pride, but out of disbelief that someone still stood by him after everything. "You'll be the death of me, witch." She smiled too, soft and sad. "Then at least it will mean I lived." Outside, the wolves howled again, closer this time, but neither moved. For the first time, they didn't feel like prey. They felt like fire in the dark, burning together, daring the world to snuff them out. Dawn came gray and thin, spilling through the cabin window like smoke. The fire had long since gone to embers, but the warmth still lingered. In the air, on their skin, in the steady rhythm of two heartbeats that refused to separate even when the morning demanded it. Elara was the first to move. She sat up slowly, her hair falling in loose waves across her shoulders, her fingers brushing the mark Kael's hand had left on her wrist. It wasn't bruising. It was memory, vivid and alive. She could still feel the echo of his heartbeat against her palm, the moment the world had narrowed to nothing but breath and touch, and the knowledge that something inside her had shifted forever. Kael stirred behind her, the furs rustling. "You're awake early." "So are you." she replied softly. He sat up, the light catching the faint scars across his chest. There were many, some healed clean, others jagged. He looked less like a wounded man now and more like the warrior he had been born to be, but there was a new stillness in him, a quiet tether, something that hadn't existed before last night. I heard them again, he said finally. The wolves. He nodded. They're closer, 2 scouts, maybe 3. The Shadow Court won't stop sending them until they find me. He looked toward the door. I can't let them find you. Elara turned to face him, her eyes steady. And I can't let you go out there half-healed. I'm not half-healed. She arched a brow. You were bleeding from your shoulder 2 nights ago. He gave a low, humorless laugh. You noticed. I notice everything, she said quietly, including when you're trying to walk into death just to prove you still deserve to live. Kael's expression faltered. That's not what this is, isn't it? She stood, her bare feet silent against the wooden floor. You think dying for your pack will erase what happened, but it won't. You can't atone for betrayal with your own blood. He rose too, closing the space between them. And you'd have me do nothing? Hide behind your wards while others die? I'd have you live, she said, voice trembling now. Live long enough to make something out of what's left. The words struck something deep inside him, deeper than any blade could reach. He'd spent so long running from ghosts that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen as a man, not a monster. Elara, he said, and her name left his lips like a prayer. But before he could take another step, the air in the cabin shifted. A wind slipped through the cracks of the door, cold, metallic, heavy with the scent of ash. Elara's head snapped up, her protection spell, the faint silver shimmer that always glowed at the edge of her wards, flickered, then dimmed. They found us, she whispered. Kael's instincts surged to life. The wolf in him stirred, golden eyes sharpening to a predator's gleam. How many? She closed her eyes, reaching out with her senses. Threads of power spread like roots beneath the earth, searching for movement, for intent. When she opened them again, her breath hitched. Not 2. Not 3. At least 6, maybe more. Kael's hands clenched at his sides. Then this ends here. No. She grabbed his arm. You can't take them all. I can try. Kael. He turned to her, voice low, steady, final. If I don't stop them now, they'll bring more. You'll never be safe. Her fingers tightened on his arm, trembling with the force of everything she wanted to say but couldn't. You don't have to face them alone. He looked at her, really looked, and for a moment, the alpha mask slipped away. What she saw there wasn't arrogance or rage, it was fear. Not for himself, but for her. I don't want your blood on my hands, he whispered. Then stop treating me like I'm already dead, she said fiercely. We fight together. The air between them crackled. Not just with magic, but with defiance, with something wild and unbreakable. Kael exhaled, then nodded once. The kind of nod that meant he knew she wouldn't yield, and that he no longer wanted her to. He reached for her hand. Then stay close to me. She smiled faintly. Always. Outside, the forest stirred, branches creaking, snow shifting under unseen paws. The howl that rose in the distance was low and haunting, answered by another, closer still. Kael turned toward the door, his golden eyes bright in the dim light. They're here. Elara raised her hand, whispering words that shimmered like sparks in the air. Then let them come. Side by side, Alpha and Outcast stood as the first shadow moved through the trees. 2 broken souls ready to face the past that had hunted them for far too long. And as the wolves' cries tore through the dawn, the storm returned. Not of snow or wind this time, but of vengeance and fire. The storm had ended days ago, but the world outside the cabin still looked like a graveyard of frost. The trees bowed under the weight of snow, their branches skeletal in the dim light. The silence was unnatural, too still, too hollow. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, Kael felt it first. A shift in the air. The faint metallic tang of blood carried on the wind. Wolf blood. His kind. But not his pack. Not anymore. He was outside, chopping firewood, when the scent hit him. In one smooth motion, he froze mid-swing, nostrils flaring, his pupils narrowed, the amber in his eyes brightening to molten gold. The axe slid from his hand and fell soundlessly into the snow. Kael. Elara's voice came from the doorway, soft and uncertain. He didn't answer. His head turned slightly toward the forest, every muscle taut, his senses sharpening like a drawn blade. The air pulsed with danger, a rhythm only his instincts could hear. They were close. Too close. Without a word, he strode toward the cabin, snow crunching under his boots. Elara stepped aside as he entered, her eyes flickering between his face and the door. "What is it?" she whispered. His voice came low, guttural. "They found me." Her blood ran cold. "The Shadow Court?" He nodded once. "Scouts. Probably 2, maybe 3. But if they've picked up my scent..." He met her eyes, his expression grim. The others won't be far behind. Elara moved quickly, pulling a rune-marked pouch from the shelf. She scattered herbs into the hearth's dying fire, whispering incantations under her breath. A faint shimmer rippled through the air as the protective wards she had placed around the cabin flared to life, weak, trembling, but still holding. Kael's gaze followed the flickering light as it faded. "It won't last," he said quietly. "I know," she murmured, her hands shaking slightly as she adjusted the charms. "But it's something." Kael turned toward her then, his expression caught between frustration and something softer. "You should leave, Elara. Now. Take the northern path. There's a ridge that'll hide your scent." Her head snapped up. "You think I'll just run while they tear you apart?" His jaw tightened. "You're not a fighter." She stepped closer, eyes flashing. "And you're not healed." For a moment neither spoke. The air between them shimmered with heat, anger, fear, unspoken longing. Finally Kael exhaled. His voice dropped to a whisper. "If they catch you with me, they'll kill you too." Elara's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Then I suppose we'll just have to make sure they don't." Outside, a distant howl broke through the silence. Long, low, and haunting. It echoed through the forest carrying the promise of blood. Kael's fingers curled into fists. The wolves were calling. Elara turned to the window, watching as the shadows between the trees began to move. Slowly, deliberately. The first of the scouts had arrived. She whispered a spell beneath her breath, and faint light flickered around her fingers like golden threads. Kael's eyes followed the glow, remembering the last time she had used her magic to save him. This time, though, he saw something different in her expression, something fierce and unyielding. "Elara," he began, but she cut him off. "No more running, Kael." Her voice was steady now. "This is our home, at least for tonight, and I will not let them take it." He stared at her for a long moment, something like pride flickering in his gaze. Then he nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Then we fight." The moment hung between them like the calm before thunder. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft, cold, and silent. But beneath that stillness, the forest trembled with movement. Shadows slipped between the trees, eyes glinting red in the dark. The hunt had begun. And in the heart of that frozen wilderness, the Alpha and the Witch stood side by side, ready to face the blood on the snow. The first wolf appeared at the tree line, black as pitch, eyes glowing with the crimson burn of the Shadow Court's curse. It didn't howl. It didn't snarl. It only watched, waiting. Kael felt his own beast rise inside him at the sight. The wild pulse of his blood quickened. The air thickened around him, humming with the power that came only when an alpha's instincts took hold. "Inside," he ordered Elara, voice low and rough. But she didn't move. She was standing near the hearth, clutching her staff, its silver veins flickering with faint light. Her hair was loose, her face pale against the shadows, and her magic trembled in the air like a live thing. "I can hold the wards for a while," she said. "But if they break through, They will, Kael interrupted grimly, pulling his sword from where it leaned by the door. And when they do, you run. Elara's lips parted in disbelief. You think I'll abandon you now? His jaw tightened. I think you'll do what I tell you to. Something sharp sparked between them. The same fire that had burned through their last argument flared again, but this time it wasn't desire. It was fear, masquerading as fury. Then the door shuddered. Once, twice, a third time. The sound was deep, heavy. Wood meeting claw. Kael's head snapped toward the noise, his wolf senses flaring. They're testing the barrier. Elara closed her eyes and lifted her hands. The air around her pulsed gold, the runes on the walls igniting like veins of fire. Outside, the shadows hissed and recoiled as the barrier flared to life, glowing faintly blue against the darkness. Stay behind me, Kael said again. I'm not your subordinate, she shot back, her voice trembling with both defiance and magic. Before he could reply, the door cracked open with a splintering sound. Snow and wind burst in. A massive wolf lunged through, eyes wild and glowing with shadowlight. Kael moved like lightning, sword slicing through the air in one fluid motion. Steel met flesh. A snarl tore through the night. The wolf crumpled, but another filled its place instantly, then another. The cabin erupted in chaos. Wood splintered, snow swirled in gusts, and the air filled with the scent of iron and ash. Kael fought like a storm given form, his movements primal, brutal, precise. Each strike was a memory, each roar a cry for the pack he'd lost. Blood spattered across his face, his chest, his hands. But for every wolf he felled, two more came. Behind him, Elara stood trembling, eyes glowing faintly gold. Her protective barrier flickered, the wards faltering under the weight of the assault. She whispered spell after spell, her voice breaking as the strain grew too much. Kael! She cried out as another wolf lunged past him, slamming her into the wall. He spun, slicing the creature down before it could reach her, but in that heartbeat of distraction, claws raked across his back, tearing through skin and muscle. He stumbled, breath ragged. The scent of his blood filled the room. Enough, Elara whispered. Her voice was trembling, but her eyes blazed. She stepped forward, raising her staff high. The air around her shifted, growing heavy and electric. Runes began to form in the air, ancient, forbidden symbols glowing red-hot against the frost. Elara, no, Kael barked. You'll kill yourself. Her voice cut through the chaos, low and fierce. Ignis ex gelu, arise. The last word left her lips like a shatter. Flames burst from the snow. It was not the gentle warmth of a hearth. It was fire born of fury and desperation, ripping through the frozen world with savage beauty. The wolves screamed as frost turned to steam, and shadows burned away beneath her power. Kael shielded his face as heat and light consumed the room. For an instant, the world vanished in white and red. When it cleared, the forest was silent again. Smoke rose from the trees and the ground was scorched black. Half the attackers were gone, turned to ash, but Elara was still standing, barely. Her staff lay broken beside her and her body trembled with exhaustion. Her lips were pale, her magic flickering out like the last flame of a dying candle. Kael turned toward her, horror tightening his chest. Elara? She smiled weakly, whispering, I told you I wouldn't run. Then her knees buckled. Kael caught her before she hit the ground, the heat of her fading magic still burning his hands. Her body was cold. Too cold. Her pulse fluttered faintly against his palm, and for the first time since his pack's death, the Alpha's voice broke. Stay with me, he whispered. Please. The snow outside glowed faintly with dying embers, blood and fire mixing as the last wind carried the ashes away. The battle was over. But the cost had only begun. The forest had fallen silent. No more howls. No more claws scraping against the wood. Only the soft hiss of snow melting on scorched ground, and the low broken sound of Kael's breathing. He held her close, one arm beneath her knees, the other wrapped around her trembling shoulders. Her head rested against his chest, her hair tangled, her skin far too pale. Each breath she took shuddered, fragile as winter light. "Elara," he whispered again, shaking her gently. "Stay awake." Her eyelids fluttered, heavy and stubborn. I'm still here," she murmured. Her voice was a whisper, barely there. "Did we win?" Kael's throat tightened. He looked around. The charred remains of the forest, the smoking silhouettes of the wolves. Victory looked nothing like this. "Yes," he said softly. "You burned them all." A faint, broken smile touched her lips. Then, "That's good." Her body sagged slightly in his arms. Panic surged through him. "Don't you dare fade," he growled, his voice cracking under the weight of his own fear. "You hear me? You don't stop breathing." He shifted her closer, his heartbeat pounding hard enough to hurt. The scent of her, ash and herbs and something faintly sweet, filled the cold air. "I told you," she murmured, eyes still closed, "that magic takes what's living to mend what's dying." He shook his head violently. "Not you. Not this time." But even as he said it, he could feel the truth in her pulse, weakening, slipping away. The fire she had summoned had taken more than her strength. It had drained the life from her bones. Kael pressed his forehead to hers, his breath rough and uneven. "You should have let me fight alone." Her lashes fluttered. "And let you die?" "No. Elara." His voice broke on her name. He had seen death before, too many times, but never like this. Not in someone who had given him back the will to live. Her fingers moved weakly, brushing his cheek. "You're warm," she whispered. "Good, that's good. Because of you," he rasped. "Because you stayed." A tear slipped from the corner of her eye, cutting a clean path through the soot on her skin. "Kael," she whispered, her breath trembling. "I was never meant to stay. The forest. It kept me alive long enough to find you." He caught her hand, pressing it to his chest. "Then stay a little longer. Please. You said even wolves deserve warmth." Her lips curved faintly. "And witches deserve mercy." Her hand fell away, limp. For a moment, Kael didn't move. The world held its breath. The wind stopped. The snow seemed to hang suspended in the air. Then he roared. It wasn't the sound of an alpha claiming dominance. It was the sound of a man losing the last light in his world. His grief shook the trees, scattering ash and snow into the air. He clutched her tighter, pressing his face into her hair. "No, no, no. Don't you dare leave me," he whispered, rocking her gently. "Not you." But the warmth was fading, and then, so faint he thought he'd imagined it, her voice brushed against his mind, not with words, but with feeling. A pulse of heat, a whisper of magic. Kael froze. The pendant at her throat, an old charm of silver and glass, glowed softly against his arm. A heartbeat of light. Then another. "Elara?" he breathed. Her chest rose shallowly, a weak gasp of air escaped her lips. He bent low, his voice breaking in relief. "You weren't my weakness," he whispered. "You were my warmth." The words fell into the night, half prayer, half confession. And in that moment, between the dying fire and the falling snow, her eyes opened just enough to see him, to hear him. Then her hand found his once more, fingers cold, but steady. Then, "Don't let it fade," she whispered faintly. "I won't." He pressed his lips to her forehead, feeling the last of her magic sink into his skin, an echo of her heartbeat, soft and lingering. Outside, the snow began to fall again, gentle this time, covering the blood and ash. The fire had gone out, but in the Alpha's arms something else remained, something neither storm nor shadow could touch. A promise, and the memory of warmth. The storm had returned by nightfall. Not the kind that clawed through the trees or buried the world in snow, but one that brewed in Kael's chest, fierce and untamed. The fire in the hearth had long since burned to embers, and yet he knelt before it, trembling. Not from cold, but from the weight of the decision before him. Elara lay upon the bed of furs behind him, her body too still, her breath so faint it barely stirred the air. The charm around her neck had dimmed to a dull gray, its pulse gone silent. He had tried everything, her herbs, her spells, his own strength, but her magic was slipping away, leaking into the night like smoke through broken glass. Kael pressed his hands against the floorboards, his claws scraping the wood. The scent of her blood, faint and metallic, haunted the room. "You saved me," he whispered. "Now you ask me to let you go?" No answer came, only the low moan of the wind outside and the sound of his heart breaking. He rose slowly, towering and grim, and turned toward her. Her face, pale and peaceful, looked almost ethereal. The firelight brushed her cheekbones, catching the shimmer of dried tears. He had seen death many times before, but this was different. This was a life that had touched his in a way nothing else ever had. A light he couldn't bear to see extinguished. Kael's gaze fell to the mark etched into his wrist. A crescent scar, old and faint. It was the sign of his lineage, the mark of every Alpha who had ruled before him. His father once told him, "The Alpha's power comes not from his strength but from his bond. What he gives willingly can never be taken from him." He clenched his jaw, feeling the old truth rise like fire in his blood. There was one bond left, the oldest, the most forbidden, the right of the Alpha's heart. It was said that to perform it was to surrender everything, to bind one's soul to another's, until death claimed both or spared both. No mortal healer, no witch, no pack dared attempt it. For when two souls were joined in that fire, there was no turning back. Kael knelt beside her, his hands shaking as he brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You gave me warmth," he murmured. "Now I'll give you life." He took the dagger from his belt, a silver blade worn and old, and drew it across his palm. Blood welled instantly, rich and dark. He pressed his hand to her heart, feeling nothing but stillness beneath her ribs. "By the law of the moon," he whispered, his voice low and steady, "and the right of the Alpha, I call upon the fire of the bond." The air shifted, the room darkened, shadows curling inward. His blood began to glow faintly where it touched her skin, veins of crimson light spidering across her chest. The fire in the hearth flared higher, golden and wild, as though answering the call. Kael's breath hitched. The power that surged through him was old, older than memory, older than the packs or the gods who watched over them. It burned through his veins like molten gold. "Take it," he growled through clenched teeth. "Take what's mine, Elara, my strength, my life, everything." The mark on his wrist blazed to life, the crescent turning into a full, burning moon. He felt it then, the pull, the thread between them, a bond forming not with words or will but with soul. The fire leapt from the hearth, curling around them in a perfect circle. His blood pulsed in rhythm with hers, though her heart was still faint, struggling, searching. Kael bent over her, his voice barely a whisper now. "Don't leave me in the cold again. Please." The flames roared, swallowing the room in gold, and for the first time since the battle, Elara breathed. It was small at first, a faint gasp, but it was enough. The blood that had mingled between them shimmered, binding, sealing. Kael's eyes widened as the pain tore through him, searing hot, as though the bond itself were burning into his bones. He clutched her hand, refusing to let go even as his vision blurred. Their hearts pounded once, twice, then fell into perfect rhythm. The mark of the moon flared on both their wrists. When the light finally dimmed, Kael fell back, panting, drenched in sweat. The room was quiet again, the storm muffled by the walls, and when he turned his head, Elara stirred. Slowly, as though waking from a dream that had lasted centuries, her eyes opened. For a moment the world seemed to stop. Her irises, once silver green, now glowed faintly gold, matching the light still flickering in his own. Kael reached for her, his hand trembling. "Elara?" She blinked, dazed, her lips parting as if to speak, but no sound came. Instead, she looked at him, truly looked. And what passed between them in that silent gaze was older and deeper than any vow ever spoken, a bond forged in blood, in fire, in love that neither had dared name until now. Elara's breath came slow, unsteady. Each inhale a struggle between the world of the living and the one that had nearly claimed her. Her body ached, heavy as stone, yet something deep inside her pulsed with a strength she did not recognize. She felt it first as a rhythm beneath her ribs, a heartbeat that wasn't her own. Then came the warmth. It started at her chest, where Kael's blood had touched her skin. The faint glow had not faded. It spread, curling through her veins like threads of sunlight, chasing away the lingering cold of death. Every pulse carried his energy, his fire, his will to keep her tethered to this world. Her lips parted with a gasp, and air flooded her lungs. Her eyes snapped open, gold and molten. The cabin swam into view, the dim firelight, the circle of ash, and Kael lying collapsed beside her, motionless. "Kael," she whispered, her voice breaking. She pushed herself up, weak and trembling, and reached for him. His skin was slick with sweat, his breathing ragged but steady. The scent of iron and smoke lingered around him. She touched his cheek gently, and the moment her fingers brushed his skin, she felt it. His heartbeat echoing through her palm. Her own heart answered in perfect unison. The sound wasn't two. It was one. Her magic shuddered in recognition. The bond was complete. Elara drew her hand back, staring at the faint shimmer that glowed across her wrist. A crescent mark, golden and alive, mirrored the one burned into Kael's skin. "What have you done?" she whispered, though she already knew. Kael's eyes opened slowly, the faintest glimmer of gold flickering in their depths. "What I had to," he rasped. "You bound us." Her voice trembled, caught between awe and fear. "The Alpha rite. Kael, that ritual is forbidden for a reason." He managed a faint smile, weary but unwavering. "I've never cared much for rules." "Do you understand what it means?" she demanded. "If I die, you die. If the bond breaks, it takes us both." Kael pushed himself upright, the movement slow and painful. "Then I'll make sure it never breaks." Elara's breath hitched. "You shouldn't have done this." "I couldn't lose you," he said simply. "Not after everything. Not after you brought me back from the edge." She shook her head, tears forming, the weight of his words cutting deeper than any blade. "You gave me your life." "I shared it," he corrected softly. "That's what an alpha does when someone, becomes his pack." The word pack caught in her chest. She wanted to argue, to scold him for his recklessness, but the truth settled in her heart like embers in ash. There was no undoing this. His fire now burned within her. Her breath sustained him. The bond hummed quietly between them, invisible but alive. When she moved, he felt it. When he exhaled, she sensed it like a whisper across her skin. A strange stillness filled the room, neither silence nor peace, but the fragile moment between two storms. Elara leaned back against the headboard, exhaustion tugging at her limbs. "The rite should have killed you," she murmured. "Your body wasn't strong enough after the battle." Kael's lips curved faintly. "Maybe not. But you've made me stronger before." Her gaze softened despite herself. "You're impossible." "I've been called worse," he said with a ghost of a grin. Outside, the storm had quieted. The first rays of dawn spilled across the snow, painting the world in pale gold. The forest, scarred from the fight, seemed to hold its breath, watching, waiting. Elara turned her eyes toward the window. "They'll come again, Kael. The Shadow Court doesn't leave unfinished hunts." "I know," he said, "but they won't find us broken." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw what he had become. No longer the wounded alpha who had stumbled to her door, no longer the haunted man burdened by ghosts. There was power in him now, tempered, balanced, shared. Her heart beat once more in rhythm with his, and a spark flared beneath her skin. The bond pulsed again, gold meeting gold. Kael's gaze caught hers. "Do you feel it?" "Yes," she breathed. "The fire." He reached out, brushing his thumb along her wrist, tracing the glowing crescent there. "It's us," he murmured. "One life. One flame." Elara closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. The fear hadn't gone, but it no longer owned her. The bond had done more than save her life. It had changed them both. And as dawn broke over the forest, the wolves stirred beyond the trees, sensing the rise of something ancient, something stronger than blood or magic, a bond born not from desperation, but from love forged in fire. The snow outside the cabin burned red where the last of the shadow court fell. The night air smelled of ash and pine, of blood and new beginnings. Elara stood beside Kael, her palm pressed against his chest, feeling the wild rhythm of the bond they had forged. The golden light in their eyes shimmered softly, pulsing in unison like two hearts beating as one. Kael's voice was low, rough with exhaustion, but filled with awe. "You should have died," he murmured, thumb brushing her cheek. "But you didn't. The bond. It called you back." Elara looked at him, at the man who had once been all fury and solitude, and saw something new behind his golden eyes. Devotion, fierce and raw. "You gave me your life," she whispered. "Why?" "Because," Kael said, stepping closer. "I couldn't watch the fire go out." The woods around them were eerily still, the storm long past. Yet the air shimmered faintly with remnants of magic, the echo of their joined power. The flames that had consumed the shadow court now danced harmlessly over the snow, warm rather than destructive, light instead of chaos. Elara's strength returned in fragments. Every breath she took was a reminder of the bond, of his heartbeat inside her, of the tether that would never break. She could feel his emotions flicker through her own chest, his protectiveness, his relief, his fear of losing her again. "Kael," she said softly, tracing the mark glowing faintly above her collarbone, the golden rune that mirrored one over his heart. "What happens now?" He looked toward the horizon where dawn was breaking, painting the mountains in shades of silver and rose. "Now," he said, "we rebuild, not just what was lost, but what can be." She smiled, weary but luminous, together, always. And in that moment, beneath the fading stars, Kael and Elara, alpha and witch, warrior and healer, stood as something new, not cursed, not broken, but bound in fire and choice. The forest around them, once haunted by death, seemed to breathe again, alive with light and life. Their story was far from over, but the bond forged in fire had turned two lost souls into one unbreakable force, and the world, though it didn't yet know it, would soon tremble for them both. Epilogue: The Thawing Heart. Winter finally broke. For the first time in years, the mountains were not silent beneath a shroud of snow, but alive with the gentle murmur of streams and the songs of waking birds. The forest, once haunted, once scarred, breathed again. Buds of green unfurled through the melting frost, and sunlight spilled through the pines like gold poured from the heavens. Kael stood on the ridge where his pack had once fallen. The wind that used to howl with ghosts now carried laughter. Wolves ran again through the valley, strong, reborn, loyal not by blood but by choice. The new pack had come from ruins and exile, from scattered survivors who had heard the Alpha's call and returned. At his side stood Elara, no longer cloaked in fear or solitude. She wore her power like sunlight wears the dawn, gentle, certain, unafraid. Her eyes still carried that quiet strength that had first disarmed him, but now there was warmth too. Peace, hard-won and deep. Kael turned to her, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. The golden mark of their bond still glowed faintly on their skin, pulsing in rhythm with the springtime heartbeat of the forest. "The snow's gone," she whispered, looking at the thawing world below. It feels strange. After all that cold. Strange, Kael said, his voice softer than the breeze. But right. Together, they walked through the rebuilt settlement. The cabins rising again, smoke curling from chimneys, young wolves training in the open field. Every soul who passed bowed to Elara, not in fear but in respect. They called her Luna of the Thaw, the healer who turned ice into life. At the center of the camp stood the great hearth, once the pack's sacred fire. Kael reached for Elara's hand and drew her close to the warmth. The flames reflected in his eyes, no longer cold steel, but molten gold. "Do you remember," he said quietly, "that night in the storm, when I asked for warmth, just a spark to keep me alive?" Elara smiled, the same smile that had undone his walls. "You nearly froze before letting me help you." Kael's lips curved faintly as he pressed his forehead against hers. "That night, I asked for just the tip of warmth," he whispered, voice breaking into reverence, "and found the flame that became my world." Elara closed her eyes as his words sank into her heart. The fire flickered between them, a living echo of everything they had survived: the storm, the blood, the shadow, the cold. Outside, the snow melted into streams that carried away the last memory of winter. Life, fragile and fierce, began again, and in the heart of the thaw, where once there had been only silence, there now lived two souls, Alpha and Luna, wolf and witch, bound by fire, by love, and by the promise that even in the coldest heart, warmth can be reborn.